Hey, what's up? It's cute what if this side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku becomes monster. Now before we move ahead with the fic, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. I'm sorry miss, but your son is quirkless. For so many years, that phrase had been the defining phrase of his life, as it was the base of his never-ending scorn from his peers and teachers, with the only exception being his mom. From playground bullies calling him names and shoving just a little too hard, or the ones in the gym locker room who beat him until he couldn't breathe properly for a few days, they were always there. He'd always wanted to become a hero. It's been his dream ever since he was able to understand the concept of heroes. But at every turn of his life, it's always been quirkless scum like you could never even think of standing at the top, and other things like that. He never told his mother about the bullies and he enjoys watching them suffer. Those who torment him. One time, back before middle school, his former best friend, Kaken, had finished his beating for the day, leaving Izuku covered in bruises and burns. They were only a few blocks away from their houses, as they were neighbors. Izuku kept his distance by about 20 feet. He saw Mitsuki open the front door and ask him where he'd been. He grumbled a non-coherent response, which led to a slap across the face from Mitsuki. Once he saw that, he was overcome with a feeling of euphoria and, despite the pain he was in, started giggling under his breath. He quickly got home and gave the usual clumsy excuse he'd always used. He got to his room and locked the door. Quickly, he replayed the image over in his head, hands clutching his face like a crazed maniac. It was a never-ending stream of such a nice feeling. His body was hot, like he'd been eating something spicy. Izuku dropped his hands from his face. He felt something hard, and it was like his pants had tightened. He looked down to see himself fully hard. He slightly shifted and gasped at the pleasure that raced through his body. He quickly ran to the bathroom to relieve himself. After about 10 minutes of stewing over what happened, he suddenly felt nauseous. This isn't what a hero is supposed to do, he thought to himself. He felt like a sicko. He couldn't believe he got off on that. It wasn't that particular event that necessarily became the turning point. However, it did make Izuku notice something peculiar. Once he got into middle school, the bullying and baiting got worse. There was never a day where he didn't come home with bruises and lacerations from the other kids' quirks. They slammed him against the wall, against lockers. They cornered him everywhere, whether the bathroom, the hallway, the schoolyard. He never got a break from the torture. His mom eventually stopped asking, knowing she wouldn't get an answer out of her son anytime soon. He still went to villain and hero fights, and still took analyses of the hero's quirk, breaking them down and figuring out how they work. It went like this for the next few years, as a routine, almost. Sometimes he'd think he'd hear a noise in the alley he walked past on a particular day. And when he got there would always be nothing but a faint smell of copper that made his skin tingle. He fought down what he thought was a revolting urge, and usually went on his way. There was only one discrepancy in this routine, and that was the one time when he was 12. He was going a different route than usual, and there was an injured cat lurking through the alleyway. He doesn't quite remember what came over him, but it happened in a flash. He lunged at the cat, biting down on it, enough to draw blood. The cat thrashed, but Izuku's grip was firm. After a few more seconds, he had drained the cat of its blood. It didn't feel quite right, however. It felt like there was something he was missing. He soon let go of the cat, scrambling back and looking at his bloody hands, startled, yet not quite terrified as he should be. He pushed the event out of his mind, refusing to even acknowledge it. However, one day, a few years later, it was his scream. He was walking through the usual underpass that was on his way home from school. There was a faint clank, and suddenly his mouth was full of a disgusting sludge. Look at that, a nice medium-sized invisibility cloak. This is perfect, kid. Thanks a million, you're my hero. Izuku struggled to grab at the thing that was suffocating him so quickly. But, he heard those words ... you're my hero. No, he thought, as his eyes closed. But in that moment, he decided, how could he be someone's hero if he can't even save himself? Before he could do anything, however, there was a gust of wind, and the invading sludge was forced out of his system. He coughed and hacked the remnants of sewage, when a hand entered his vision. His coughing slowed, as he gazed up at the owner of the hand. When he saw All Might, he thought he might have started screaming. Or maybe asking for his autograph, but no. Izuku just stood there with unseeing eyes until a single thought passed through. Can someone without a quirk be a hero? The brilliant grin that showed on his idol's face dimmed, and seemed more and more fake. Then, he stood there, arms still outstretched, and Izuku knew. He knew that what he spouted on TV about everyone can become a hero was a lie. I'm sorry my boy, but this situation should be enough to know, you can't. I'm sorry. All Might seemed to hesitate for a moment, but you could always be a police officer. Or detective. That's an honorable job as well. With that, he flew off into the distance, having apprehended the villain while Izuku was still comprehending the situation. He'd always said that the incident before middle school wasn't the turning point. But instead, he thought it was the start of a long catalyst. It was starting to get dark out, and he thought his mom would worry if he came home late. He grabbed the backpack he had dropped when the villain had grabbed him. It was slightly scorched, but nothing he hadn't seen before. His mother greeted him when she got home. He told her he was going to bed early and to not bother him. please. Once Izuku got into his room, he opened his computer and put in his paid-off effort of having a lot of free time over the years from a lack of friends. He hesitated with his hand over the keyboard. Did he really want to do this? Loop the security cam so he could go out and enjoy the pleasure he's been bottling up for so long. Yes, access granted appeared across his screen, and the cams were now set to a 6-hour loop. That seemed like enough time to get his work done. He changed out of his middle school uniform and put on a pair of black jeans, a nondescript black hoodie that he'd once bought in hopes that he could blend in, concealer to mask his freckles, and some jet black contacts. He waited approximately 1 hour until he was sure his mother had gone to bed. Izuku poked out his head as he cracked his door. No mother in sight. He put to use his stealth skills gained after so many years of torment. He went up to the knife block and pulled out the second largest knife. He went back to his room, closed and locked the door, before placing pillows under his covers, opening the window, and climbing out into the night air. He stuck to dark alleys and security camera blind spots until he made it to the block where he'd looped the cameras. From there, he waited nearly 30 minutes, until his first victim wandered into his line of sight. Oh, even better, it was his own teacher. What a coincidence. Izuku grabbed the man by the collar of his shirt and yanked him into the dark alleyway, covering his mouth with his gloved hand to prevent him from screaming. He then dragged the man further into the depths. Izuku dropped the man into the ground without care. He went around behind him and put the knife to his throat. Everyone here wants to be heroes, huh, sensei? The man's expression changed to a mixture of confusion and terror. Wait, you're one of my students. Which one? Whatever I've done to you, I'm sorry, I'll stop. Izuku's grin turned manic, and he spoke softly. What have you done? Oh, no. Sensei. His voice turned low and menacing. It's what you haven't done. Small giggles escaped the boy, and he gripped his knife tighter against his sensei's jaw. He could see the teacher tense up and try desperately to figure out who it was. Your time's up. The knife loosened slightly, but not enough for the man to escape. Sensei, he spoke with a happy-go-lucky chime to his voice. I've always been so positive, always trying to achieve my dreams. Yet I could never do it. Why? His teacher seemed to come to a realization, making him squirm in the teen's arms. Izuku stood over the man's body, looking him in the eye, and leaning down close to his face in a crouch. He bent down toward the teacher's ear and spoke. It was because I was the useless, quirkless Deku. He didn't give the man any time to respond before he plunged the knife through his throat. The man was choking on his own blood, and Izuku felt the pleasure course through his veins at the sight. He took some of the blood and licked it off his fingers. Izuku shivered as he savored the sweet, coppery taste, with his eyes shining as the man's went lifeless. His mouth watered, and he felt something in his mind compel him to indulge in this feeling. This urge. He bent down onto the man's slit throat and drank. Pleasure like he'd never felt ran down his spine, and a gasp left his lips, followed by a moan. All of those almost moments were nothing compared to this. As he gulped the blood eagerly, he felt his body grow slightly. His muscles got bigger, and his nails got sharper, as did his teeth, and his tongue grew a little longer. After he all but sucked the corpse dry, Izuku stood, and an idea struck him. He took some of what was left of the man's blood, and wrote the letter Q on the brick wall. He wiped all evidence of him being there besides the man's body, and used his newfound strength to get home faster. He knew he was covered in blood, so he decided to climb through his window once more, and clean up his trail and take a shower, thanking whatever deity out there that his mom was a deep sleeper. He took his outfit off and washed all the makeup off his face. He got into and stayed in the shower until the water was clear of red. Now, Izuku stood bare, in only boxers, in front of his mirror. He was checking to make sure he wasn't imagining things, and no, he wasn't. The edges of his teeth had indeed gotten a tad bit sharper. Same thing with his muscles, they had gotten bigger. Not enough to be outwardly noticeable, no, but enough that Izuku could tell the difference. Izuku stuck out his tongue to the mirror and was shocked to find that it was indeed longer as well. Where he could barely reach the bottom of his nose, it now reached the tip. With these changes he could only assume this was his quirk. The implications of what that means, he's no longer quirkless. This thought made something of a cackle bubble up his throat. He couldn't tell Kaken, because then he'll have to explain why it happened. Morning came, and his mother was none the wiser. It wasn't hard to hide his mouth, as he's been speaking a lot less lately anyway. Izuku fixed his uniform as much as he could, even though it already felt a little tight around him, but not by much. He said goodbye to his mom and he headed off to school. He got onto the train, and started unconsciously salivating at all the people crowded around him. Luckily, he caught himself just as he licked his lips. Izuku sighed, not even a few hours later, and he already wanted more. He could feel something at the back of his mind, egging him on. Once the train announced his destination though, he cleared those thoughts from his mind, and focused on being the same, old, Deku. He walked for a few minutes, letting his mind wander, until he arrived at the school gates. He prepared himself for the usual hell as he went inside. He got to his classroom, a few minutes before the bell. Shortly after, their principal walked in, and gave them some news. Well, it seems your lovely sensei has quit his job as a teacher. Izuku frowned slightly. They were going to cover it up. So, now you'll have a substitute teacher for the rest of the year until we find a new one. That's when the muttering started. For once it wasn't him, but everyone else in the class, wondering what could have happened. School went on as normal though, with the same amount of violence inflicted on Izuku than ever. And finally the last bell of the school day rang, dismissing everyone for the day. That's when Izuku heard familiar footsteps coming his way. "Oi, Deku." Izuku looked up at Bakugo, staying silent. Bakugo scowled and picked Izuku up by his collar. If Bakugo noticed that the boy was heavier than usual, he didn't say anything. "Don't effing ignore me, Deku. I saw that smug look you had today. Think you're better than me," Bakugo said. Izuku felt his shirt light up from a mini explosion granted by the blonde. Oddly enough, it didn't sear his skin as much, meaning his skin must have toughened out too. And no, Kaken. It seemed Izuku put on a good show, because Bakugo dropped him carelessly, letting him fall to his knees like a puppet with its strings cut. Bakugo turned around to both of the goons who always followed him around. Izuku was left alone in the classroom. He wiped off as much ash as he could from his blazer and turned around to grab his backpack. Swinging it onto his shoulder, he walked out of the school, walking with no particular destination in mind. As he walked through the bustling streets of downtown Musutafu, the news station stayed the same as ever. No mention of his former sensei anywhere. Maybe it was because by the end of it he was shriveled up like a raisin. Or the cue he left on the wall. He shrugged his shoulders. It didn't matter, not when he was going to do it again soon. He entered the throng of people going on their way after a hard day of work. However, that proved to be a mistake, because once he was crowded around in every direction, he started salivating like crazy. These people, these humans, smelled divine to him. Before he could reach out at someone, he caught his own wrist, panting heavily, and using as much willpower as he could to extricate himself from the crowd and into a twist of alleys. Once he got far away enough, he put one hand on the wall, and one on his knees. Once he had calmed down, he checked over his shoulder to scan the surroundings to make sure he wasn't followed, and let out a sigh of relief when he found nothing. Izuku wiped himself off of any grime he may have acquired as he hurried away. He made his way out of the alley and back toward the metro station. Careful to keep his distance from anyone, he made it to his station, luckily keeping from doing anything embarrassing. He walked down his familiar route home, sometimes stopping to observe the people he passed by. He got home safely and found a note on the table that said his mother was out getting groceries. He was glad, because if she were here he might not have been able to control himself. He stumbled to his room and closed the door, locking it. He stood there for a moment, before tugging his uniform off and once again slipping on a dark shirt and pants. He put on the rest of his makeup and went to head out. He made it to his living room, but then he heard the door click and froze. Inko walked in, arms full of groceries. She went and set them on the counter and she yelled, "Zuku, I'm home." Izuku knew he couldn't very well run to his room, as that'd be suspicious. But then again, he's in a very bad situation where everything he'd do would be suspicious. "Izuku, honey." Inko wandered over to the living room and stopped when he saw Izuku standing there next to the couch. He was trembling slightly and Inko wondered if he was sick. She walked closer to him, but he managed to bite out, "Stop. Mom, don't come closer to me." Inko looked at her son, confusion written all over her face. "Izuku, what's wrong? Are you sick? Talk to me, honey," she told him. When Izuku said nothing, gritting his teeth, Inko said, "Well, if you're feeling bad, then I could make some yakitori." She made her way into the kitchen hesitantly and got out the supplies she needed. Unfortunately, as she was picking up the can of broth, a serrated edge on the top of the can cut her finger open, making it bleed quite a bit. Izuku's nostrils flared, and he looked up from where he was hunched over in place, teeth pulled into a snarl. He stalked to the kitchen, like a predator hunting its prey, and narrowed in on the blood on Inko's finger. She had her back toward him and was facing the counter, nursing her finger. He no longer had the mental capacity to warn her, and instead he leapt forward, grabbed her arm with both hands, and put his mouth around her bleeding finger, trying to get as much blood as possible. Inko nearly shrieked and tried to get her son's attention, repeatedly. She tried pulling her finger back and earned a feral-sounding growl for her efforts. Was this really her son? She tried to call his name again. It was no use, he wasn't responding to her. That's when she noticed a difference in her boy. His muscles noticeably swelled, and his eyes grew more crazed. "Midoriya Izuku." Izuku abruptly let go of her arm and finger, eyes clearing from their fog. He stumbled backward, so much that he fell onto the floor. There was blood on his chin and staining his teeth. He was breathing heavily, staring at her in horror. His face was frozen for a moment, before it scrunched up and tears began to fall. "I'm a monster," he whispered to himself. Inko looked at her finger, slowly regaining its blood. She quickly bandaged it, and kneeled in front of her boy, and hugged him as he was crying. "Hey, don't worry, baby. It's okay. You're not a monster. You just surprised me, that's all. See, I'm fine." She placated him, holding up her bandaged finger with a reassuring smile on her face. Even through his tears, Izuku gave a small smile. While Inko noticed small incisors, Inko smiled back, and said, "So is this your quirk, sweetheart?" Izuku looked down and nodded numbly. "Oh, don't be so glum. When did it come in? She wondered. Izuku mumbled something incoherent. What was that, sweetie? Inko asked. Izuku looked away. Last night. Oh, why is that? Does it have anything to do with the reason that you have a substitute teacher for the rest of the year? Inko questioned, a mischievous edge to her voice. Izuku's head snapped up to her. How? Inko smiled and put a finger to her lips. I'm not that deep of a sleeper, dear, she told him. Also, one of my knives is missing. Izuku figured he couldn't have gotten his impressive analyst skills from nowhere. This was just proof. He felt a little better, but wait. Aren't you disgusted? Aren't you going to run from a freak like me and call the police? I killed someone, Mom. I enjoyed it. He started rambling, hands gesturing every which way. He fell silent when a finger silenced him, luckily not the injured one. SHH. It's okay. You're not a freak, honey. She cupped both her hands on his face and leaned in to kiss his forehead. He relaxed in her hold and absent-mindedly licked the remaining blood off his lips. After that, he realized, oh, my tongue grew again. His tongue had indeed grown. Before, it had gone to the tip, now it went to the middle of his nose. He turned to his mom and checked over her bandaged finger with worry. There was an extra puncture, but other than that there was nothing else. Eventually, they had dinner, although Izuku found he wasn't as hungry as he should have been. He quietly ate his food, and once they were done, he stayed to help his mom with the dishes, and also to spend the evening in her company. He constantly apologized every time he saw her expression as her finger twinged. Inko, of course, noticed his makeup, as it was hard to miss. She let him out on his walk, with the promise to be careful, so he'd wandered around. He kept his hood up, as he passed thugs and homeless people. Then, his nose picked up the upwind. Someone was following him. Izuku was careful to not let on that he suspected something. He wandered into an alley that he knew was a dead end. He jumped up to the fire escape with little grace. The person following him turned out to be two people. He recognized them when they turned around, probably to look for him. He followed the metal grate of the fire escape toward the opening of the alley, where he jumped down and cornered both boys. They whipped around when they heard Izuku behind them. Standing in front of him was Fingers and Wings. He hadn't bothered to learn their names. He saw that he was still recognizable then. Good to know. What's a stupid Deku like you doing out here? Ah, there it was. That stupid nickname. Oh, how he hated it. He narrowed his eyes. And why should I tell you? Obviously they were not expecting him to rebuke, because Fingers was noticeably taken aback. Looks like useless Deku's got a mouth on him. Well, you should know that freaks aren't welcome in this part of town. He noticed Wings try to circle behind him. Fingers, as he was aptly named, stretched his fingers out to try and grab Izuku. He ducked and stared at the fingers for a moment before biting down on two of them. Hard enough that one of them fell off, and another one was barely hanging on by a thread. Fingers screamed, but was quickly shut up by an elbow to the jaw. Before Wings could move to retaliate, Izuku swept his feet out from under him, pushing both of them further into the alley. Once he was sure Fingers was properly incapacitated, he turned to Wings, who was a few feet next to him. Deciding to make Fingers watch, he glanced down at him, picked him up, and proceeded to use a clawed hand to tear into Wings' stomach, taking a small chunk out. Not enough for him to bleed out, but enough to make it painful. Then, he made eye contact with Fingers and put the viscera into his mouth, chewing and swallowing. A pause. He grew an inch. Fingers was quivering on the ground. Wings was unable to scream, due to Izuku holding him by the throat. Izuku slammed him down on the concrete, creating a noticeable impact where Wings had landed. Izuku's eyes glanced at Fingers again, who was cowering. He yelled at him, "Villain." And Izuku hummed in acknowledgement. "Villain, huh? Yeah, I like the sound of that," he said, side-eyeing Fingers, before turning his gaze back down and mutilating Wings' body. It was delightful. Izuku thought the blood was good, but this was so much better. He couldn't help it. A mon escaped him as he bit into the shoulder, and his back arched. Wings was thrashing, but it was clear to see that the more Izuku ate, the stronger he was becoming. It was such an intoxicating feeling. His form grew, his legs gained an extra joint, and his feet morphed into something more avian. Clearly blood was only the beginning. Wings kept struggling, not realizing that it was useless. His thrashing eventually became weaker. He sat there, eating, for a few more minutes, until he finally found his prize. Wings' chest cavity was gone, with the ribs sticking out, and Izuku's eyes were drawn to the still beating heart, even after Wings had taken his last breath. He plucked out the heart with razor-sharp, steel-looking talons, staring at it with far-gone eyes. Then, he tilted his head back as he plopped it into his mouth, savoring the taste and texture as if it were a sweet plum. He chewed and swallowed it, making a satisfied noise. There was a larger change than the previous ones, as he finished swallowing the heart. He turned back to Fingers, a pleasant smile full of too many teeth on his face, as if he hadn't just eaten Fingers' best friend right in front of him. He towered over the boy. Soft giggles escaped him, forcing the other to shrink away. He knelt down and harshly grabbed Fingers' chin. "Bawa, you should feel lucky. Our sensei didn't get special treatment like you," he cooed, eyes wide and crazed with insanity. Fingers trembled. "Why you what?" he nearly whispered. Izuku let out a manic cackle. "Yes, it was me." It proves he paused, and leaned down right next to the terrified boy's ear, and spoke in a low, guttural voice, "that I'm not weak. Izuku plunged his hand straight through the boy's head. He stared down at the cooling corpse in front of him, giddy. It took him less time than wings to eat fingers, as he wasn't focused on making a show out of it. Just as he was licking his fingers about to go back, his phone rang. He picked it up, hands unfortunately rid of skin at that moment. So he picked it up from the top with his thumb and index finger, and pressed the accept button with his nose. Izuku. It's been a while, are you doing okay? Izuku tried to answer her, and he did, but he growled into the phone instead, unknowingly sending chills down Inko's spine. He then stopped and made what sounded like a contemplative sound, before purring. Oh okay honey, I'm going to assume that means you're doing okay, just get back in less than an hour. You have school tomorrow. He grumbled and went about doing his business as his mom hung up. He made sure, before he forgot, to put a U on the wall of the alley. He reached down to grab Finger's heart, eating it whole, before disappearing into the shadows. Inko was sitting in her living room, waiting for her son to come home. He had been gone for about an hour and a half, and she had gotten worried. So she called him, asking him how he was doing. The response she got, though, chilled her. She could hear him breathing on the other side of the phone. And she got a growl that would have made her collapse had she been standing up. Wait, what did her son do? Before she could respond, he started, and sounded like he was trying to make a noise to convey his message. He ended up purring, making her coo slightly. She hung up, and went about setting newspapers on the floor, to hopefully reduce a mess that is most likely to happen. About 10 minutes passed, and her window shook. A large, very large holy shit, claw scratched at the window. She hurried to unlock it, and as she did, the lights flickered as she watched a large taloned hand, with each talon as big as her hands, open the window. What seemed like a liquid shadow filled in the space of the window. The entire mass of it seemed to fill the whole living room, sans her. It took shape and she saw the large talon from earlier, and she saw a monstrous creature's head take shape, with rows and rows of teeth as it opened its mouth. The monster itself was void black, with the only color being the slate green on its head, and the vibrant purple shade of its eyes. Inko did her best not to tremble, for what she knew to be her son. Izuku. The creature, from where it sat still as frozen as a statue, moved like rippling water, purring once more. Although the purring was slightly terrifying for Inko, since it was done with the head right next to her, the head that was larger than she was. Honey, yes you look beautiful, increased purring, but you have school tomorrow, so do you think you can figure out how to disguise yourself? She told him. He grumbled, and Inko thought the sound was rather cute. Izuku shifted, and slowly, but surely, the creature the size of the living room and even some of the kitchen, receded into itself, until, after quite a while, it was the size of her son. Although, he still mostly looked like the creature. She went over to him and helped him from where it looked like he was about to collapse. He did collapse in her arms, panting heavily. She wiped the sweat she could see gathering on his forehead. She carried him to his room, tucking him into bed, and planting a kiss on his still void black forehead. Inko then closed the door, and reminisced on how she had been so worried that Izuku wasn't going to get any power. She could see his sadistic streak though, ever since Mitsuki had called and said that Katsuki had gotten in a fight with him, just in time for him to rush into the house, unable to hide the absolute bliss on his face. That's when she knew he had to at least have something. It started 2 nights ago, when she could tell that Izuku had had a bad day at school. He was unknowingly voicing his frustration, and then he started mumbling about how it was time. She never actually went to sleep, though. About an hour of waiting later, she could hear the soft pitter-patter of muffled footsteps in the kitchen. She heard the distinct sound of a blade on wood and correctly assumed that it was the sound of the knife block. The footsteps led back to his room, and she waited a little while, before going out and examining the knife block, impressed that he managed to think of the second largest, which would be used to avoid suspicion. Then, she had gotten up in the morning, fixing Izuku breakfast. He hid it pretty well, she had thought. Most would go mad, after a hunger lull of 15 years. That's completely unheard of. Actually, that's probably why all the revolutionaries didn't last. Anyway, most would go mad, within an hour of waking up. Her son went the whole workday, and it was only after 8 hours that she got home, and found him standing behind the couch. She's at least glad to know what he looks like when out hunting. He was trembling, and she was genuinely worried because she hadn't seen anyone last this long. She asked about him, and went to make yakitori. When she picked up the can though, and cut her ring finger, right at the major artery there, she knew what was going to happen. She turned around to try and get a bandage, but was ambushed before even trying. Izuku had grabbed her arm with both hands in a death grip, and put his mouth straight at the source. She had felt the blood draining rapidly, and had rapidly panicked as to what was happening. No one has ever had this much of an extreme reaction. It took her repeated tries to shake him off. Eventually, she did. Just in time too. Her hand had been in the process of decoloring. She had soothed his doubt and worries. It didn't matter if her son had any abilities or not. She eventually started to convince him. They ate dinner and spent some time together, then she saw Izuku's fidgeting, and she could tell he was itching to get out. She encouraged him to go on his walk, only wishing him safety. And then there was last night. She's never heard of anyone with that kind of growl. They've always been so quiet in comparison. She knows he'll make waves for sure, he'll get the chance that no one else was ever given. Izuku woke up the next morning, feeling like a completely different person. He looked down at his pitch black hands, and it obliged to his will of making it look like nothing changed. He was expecting that to take longer than it did. He got on his uniform in no time, before heading out into the kitchen. He was glad he wasn't imagining that his mom was never disgusted with him after last night. She saw him and smiled even brighter, and then gave him a big hug. She made breakfast for the both of them and they bade their goodbyes to each other. He got to school and let the teacher go over roll call, skipping over fingers and wings. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Bakugo tense in his seat. Oh, was there something that happened before he found them? He let the bad school day wash over him, and he made his way home, greeting his mother with a smile on his face that he hadn't had in years. Eventually, 10 months passed, and it had been a great year for Izuku. He had gone out once a week, giving in to his awakened urge. Katsuki was yapping about how Izuku shouldn't even try to follow him to UA. Good thing Izuku doesn't plan to. He's gotten so much stronger in a rather short amount of time. He'd earned a name for himself, one he'd made himself. It had started with the Q and the U he'd made on the brick walls of his crime scene. He was going to write QUIRKLESS, but by the time he got to the I, it had finally solidified that he had a quirk, and changed it. He was now known as the villain, Quirkless. About a month or so ago, a well-known broker in the villain community came up to him and gave him some potential offers. He had turned him down though. He's waiting right now. The moment is coming. He knows it. People have been baiting him somewhere. Can't find any victims. Don't worry, here's a conveniently placed freshly killed corpse around the corner, no other person in sight. At that particular moment, he was in an empty alley, having been deliberate in his unlucky stint for food. He finally called out firm but soft. There's no reason not to tell me why you've been following me and trying to get me to do something. A few seconds passed by. Then, black mist appeared in front of him, and stepping out, was a man made of mist himself. We have an offer for you, he said, before turning around and walking back into the mist. The mist stayed open, and he didn't have that much doubt that it was done for making a decision. Go in, or go out. Well, the answer is pretty obvious. He'd been getting quite bored lately. He stepped into the portal as well. When he stepped through the portal, he appeared to be in a bar, with the mist man behind the counter, and a man who looked to be in his early 20s, covered head to toe in severed hands. Kurogiri, what's this runt doing here? He doesn't look like he'd be a decent addition to my party. The hand man, presumably the leader, complained. Izuku looked around, and found a nearby chair, not wanting to stand around while getting insulted. As he sat down, he glowered at the leader. If you came here just to insult me, I'm just gonna leave. I heard you had an offer for me and I thought it'd be worthwhile, but so far, I'm not impressed. He crossed his arms and leaned back. Kurogiri stepped forward, leaning on the bar, still cleaning a wine glass. What Shigaraki here was saying, he doesn't believe you to be the same person that Jiren had told us about, he said. Izuku blinked, momentarily confused. Wait, what'd he tell you? He asked. It was Shigaraki who spoke up this time. He said you'd leave an impression, and that you were strong. And that's what we need. But he didn't specify anything. He grumbled the last part, looking like a petulant child. Izuku smirked. I'm guessing he didn't tell you how old I was, he guessed. The silence following was answer enough. Well, I'm here, and I'm getting bored. So what do you want? Shigaraki suddenly stood up, clenching his fist. We want to kill All Might, he declared. And Izuku was pretty impressed with his gall, but, oh yeah, well, what about after? He questioned. Shigaraki seemed to fumble. What? What do you mean after? Did he not think this through? Izuku shrugged and looked him in the eye. Well, yeah, say we kill All Might, then what? Do we disband? Go on to change the world or something? Please tell me you have more than that, he told him. Tamura. A new voice cut in, raising Izuku's hackles. He looked for the source and found it to be from a computer with text reading sound only. Shigaraki responded, yes, sensei. Izuku watched as Shigaraki turned to the computer screen with a look of utter devotion. Tell him your plan, this sensei said. Shigaraki seemed surprised. He turned to Izuku, visibly uncomfortable, and said, we're planning on ambushing UA during one of the hero classes. We have a weapon created to kill All Might specifically. Izuku processed this for a moment, going over the plan in his head. He nodded in agreement to the plan. All right, sounds legit. But where do I fit in this? He eventually told them. He could see a bit of Shigaraki's smile from where it was covered by the hand on his face. That's easy. You'll be among our grunts, he exclaimed. Yeah, that was the wrong thing to say. Izuku, who had a small smile on his face, let it widen, peeling open the skin on the side of his face, so the smile was impossibly wide. What? He spoke, his voice echoing around the room, sounding like many voices, instead of just one. Izuku was in Shigaraki's face, holding him a foot off the ground, with no one else having seen him move. Listen here, he started. I'll join on one condition. I'm a party member, as important as you or Mistman here, he said, letting go of Shigaraki's shirt and stalking back to his seat. He let his smile fall, and the occupants of the room could see the seams in his cheeks flow back together, as if they'd never been ripped in the first place. Shigaraki was panting, near out of breath. Fine, he looked at Kurogiri and the computer. Deal. Izuku smiled, as innocent-looking as he could. Great. I'd like to go home, please. He spoke the last part to Kurogiri, who merely nodded, dazed. The portal opened up in the alley next to his house, and he walked out of it with the burner phone. He bade them goodbye. The portal closed up. Sensei, what was that? Not who, but what? For a moment all occupants of the bar had seen an eldritch being with as many eyes as to overwhelm, and a devastating presence that even made the man behind the computer shiver in some hint of what he'd not felt in a long time. Fear. Through the computer, one could hear a light hum, followed by a shiver. Oh, Tamira, I think that was an important part of our plan. He may have been small, but unlike you, I've seen him in action. Kurogiri has as well. Most villains like that are all brawn and no brains. But this boy is both. He'll be a devastating ally. A few weeks passed, and Izuku was given the approximate time the mission was a go-ahead. So he fasted, and about 3 weeks passed before he got the call. He told Kurogiri his location, and a portal appeared in front of him. He grinned and stepped through, appearing in an in-between space to the side of Shigaraki, and in front of hundreds of thugs and minor villains. Shigaraki side-eyed him. Got a disguise? He asked. Izuku nodded, and pitched his skin black, eyes colored a bright purple, and made it so that he was wearing a suit. Shigaraki seemed impressed, and let it be. Soon after, they were given the go-ahead from Kurogiri, and the portal opened, showing the new hero hopefuls. The 3 of them, plus the Namu, stepped out next to the central fountain, the thugs in front of them. Then, Izuku caught sight of something, or someone. Distantly, he heard the teacher, Eraserhead, if he remembered correctly, yell at the students to run. But he knew Kurogiri had it covered. He lightly nudged Shigaraki, the one with the gauntlets, quirk, explosion. He's mine. Shigaraki didn't seem to care. Sure, whatever. Izuku informed Kurogiri of this, and was dropped off in what looked like the ruins zone. Oh, he could see him now, with another person. He looked at him for a second, not affected by Katsuki's explosions. Barely any clothing, so unprotected, must have some sort of hardening quirk. Yes, this would work quite well for him. He made his way into the building, carelessly stepping over the defeated hooligans. He climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, and saw him. Izuku couldn't help the hysterical giggles that escaped from him, catching the 2 students' attention. Another small fry we need to beat into the ground," Katsuki yelled. The red-haired student next to him looked more hesitant. Not so fast," Izuku started. Hands in the air. Bikubro, wasn't he one of the villains up front? Unfortunately, he was ignored. Katsuki just shifted into a more battle-ready position. Katsuki, as impatient as ever, no. Izuku couldn't keep a smile off his face. Katsuki blinked, and who the F are you? Izuku couldn't help it once again, he laughed. Oh, you don't remember me. I'm the last person that your little lackeys saw. What was it? Fingers and wings, I think you called them. He paused. I saw how you screamed such vulgar things at them. Then went on your merry way, he answered. Katsuki clenched his fist, and a vein started bulging in his forehead. Oh, it looked like Izuku had hit a nerve. Katsuki roared as he lunged toward Izuku. You F-er. What right did you have to kill them? They did nothing to you. Izuku just grabbed the right hook that he always started with and flipped Katsuki over. He only took a single glance at the other kid before transforming his arm to vault him through the wall and out of the building. He turned around and gazed back at Katsuki, whom he was holding down with his other hand. What right? He started. He looked at Katsuki, mere inches from his face. He smiled the widest smile he could muster, meaning it was completely ear to ear, and spoke lowly, I don't know, Kaken. What did they do to me? Izuku could see the realization, and then the cold dread that seeped into him. Deku. Katsuki all but whispered. Katsuki looked up at Izuku, who still had that wicked, fanged smile. Oh, yes Katsuki, it's me, Izuku confirmed. Then a look of absolute bliss formed on his face, and oh, they tasted delightful, so scared and weak, and they say revenge tastes sweet, and I just have to say, I agree, he happily told Katsuki. Katsuki glared up at him. You effing sicko, you can't be Deku. That wimpy little kid has always wanted to be a hero. And he doesn't even have a quirk. An imposter like you should at least know that. He spat. Shut up. Izuku hollered, landing a hit on Katsuki's head. The sight just filled him with ecstasy as he shifted to straddle Katsuki, getting a hard-on from the euphoria. Katsuki noticed this and thrashed, but it just riled up Izuku. He grinded onto Katsuki's hips, a breathy moan escaping his lips. He took the hand not pinning Katsuki down, and grabbed a hold of his groin, massaging it until it had no choice but to perk itself up, straining against his hero suit. Izuku stopped his massaging and just tightly gripped it. Childhood friend or not, you're just so excited, aren't you? He taunted. Katsuki had tears burning the corners of his eyes, threatening to fall in shame. Izuku took notice of this and focused on it. What's this? I thought heroes never cried. Or are those tears of joy? Joy that you finally get to be F'd within an inch of your life like you've always dreamed about. The tears finally fell as Katsuki choked out. Please, no. That got a cackle out of Izuku, who replied, begging now I see. Didn't know you were such a slut. He tightened his grip on Katsuki's neck and leaned down to whisper, oh don't worry yourself, Kaken, who would ever want to sleep with you? Izuku then bit down and tore a large chunk of Katsuki's ear off of the top, earning a pained screech. Izuku moaned as he chewed on the first thing he's had to eat in weeks. He soon came on the ground next to Katsuki's head. Then, he felt more than he heard All Might arrive. He rolled his hips on Katsuki's again to taunt him, before punching him again, knocking the blonde unconscious. He got up and launched himself all the way back to Shigaraki's side, thanks to the brief snack. The hand-covered man just side-eyed him, grumbling, "Took you long enough." He turned back to where All Might was standing in front of them, glaring. Izuku put on his most innocent-looking eyes, and dashed around All Might's feet, dodging the man's swings. "Oh, I've always wanted to meet you." Izuku forced stars into his eyes. "I just have to ask you a question." Izuku then CC'd his fist back, and slammed it in the part of his body that just smelled rotten. It seemed he was right, because some blood escaped, and landed on Izuku's chin. He dashed to the fallen hero, landing straight on the point of impact. Can someone without a quirk be a hero? Now that got the hero's attention. He used a finger to wipe the blood off his chin, before staring straight into All Might's eyes as he slowly licked it. "Although, I suppose it doesn't matter now." He laughed. He glanced back at Shigaraki, who looked slightly confused, but gave him a go-ahead. The people in the vicinity up to this point had only seen a kid with pitch-black skin who seemed to personally know All Might, and had vaguely done damage to him. They didn't seem to see the threat as All Might did. Because for sure, there was no way this was the same kid from just 10 months prior. But it was, wasn't it? He could tell. And no. The boy smiled and laughed as his form shifted. He melted into black ethereal shadow, his arms lengthening as well as his legs, which gained an extra joint. He became much larger than both the bird-headed creature and All Might himself. He had a sort of striped pattern, both with black, but one seemed normal and one seemed soul-sucking. Unbeknownst to him, flickering in and out of sight all over his body, were thousands of eyes, or it might have been teeth. Regardless, everyone in the vicinity felt like they were in the presence of an apex predator. His head was daunting, as he opened his mouth to reveal rows upon rows of razor-sharp teeth. He cackled once more, except it was warped and distorted, shattering glass in the dome, but not the dome itself. People hurried to cover their ears, to prevent their eardrums from shattering. The creature looked around, and licked its lips with a long forked tongue. Claws half as big as the fountain swiped downwards to All Might, creating 3 long, deep gashes in his chest. The creature glanced down at Shigaraki and gestured his head. Shigaraki, getting the message, yelled, "NOMU." The bird-headed creature obliged and launched itself toward All Might. Somehow, All Might remained standing, attempting to block each of the creature's punches. He managed to incapacitate the Namu, just in time for the other heroes to arrive. Snipe shot in the direction of Shigaraki, who took most of the hits, yet was blocked by the huge creature as it was shrinking down, back into the boy. The 3 villains left through a portal, leaving the heroes to deal with the aftermath. When the portal opened back up into the bar, Izuku jumped out and up to perch on one of the bar stools. His arms hung by his sides, slightly forward, and still morphed into razor-sharp talons that looked as though they were made of steel. Shigaraki came out next, followed by Kurogiri. Shigaraki stopped a few feet in front of Izuku, who was staring at him and humming something nonsensical. Finally, he said, "The F was that?" Izuku shrugged. "You're gonna have to be more specific than that," he responded, eyes lingering restlessly around the room. Shigaraki made frustrated hand movements. "That effing creature. What was that?" Izuku's eyes snapped into focus on Shigaraki, who startled at the sudden attention. "I'd tell you, but then I'd have to kill you," he said. Shigaraki looked to be on the verge of a horrified rage. "Is that a threat?" he screeched. Izuku snorted. "Nah, Shiggy, that's what you call a joke." "That's what I look like," he finally answered. Shigaraki took on the posture of a pouting teen, unsure of whether or not to be offended that he didn't get the joke, or insulted because of that nickname. While Shigaraki stewed in the corner, Kurogiri stepped in and asked, "Does that mean that this current form is fake?" Izuku shook his head. "Nah, I did look like this, but then I got hungry. So that's that." He made it clear that that was the end of the conversation, as he shifted his arms back to human ones and hopped off the stool. Izuku turned around and gestured for Kurogiri to open a portal. He did, and Izuku stepped out onto his front porch, changing to his original form. He walked into his house, just in time for him to have a massive hunger pang. He texted his mom to let her know, and she responded in thanks. Ugh, he was so focused on Katsuki that he didn't get to any of the other students. He got up from the couch and went to the window of his room, pulling it up and slipping out. As he jumped across rooftops, he saw that on the big screens of downtown, even from this far away, were showing the USJ and its aftermath apparently. He slowed down from where he was, having got wind of some escalated yelling. He peered down to where there was a door held open by a very small person, who was yelling at someone inside, presumably his parents. He finally shouted, "Fine," and slammed the door as he went to the alley next to his house. Izuku recognized him. He was one of the hero students at the USJ. Well, wasn't he lucky? He silently hopped down from the roof, turning his skin back to the pale color of his makeup-ed self. He then walked toward the boy, making sure to let his footsteps be heard. It was only when he was within 5 feet of him that he noticed there was someone behind him. Have the heroes not taught them about situational awareness yet? Oh well, at least that's good for him. "Oh, I saw you on the news. Weren't you one of those hero students at the USJ?" The boy turned around, before attempting to presumably puff out his chest, yet all he managed to do was look bloated. Yes, that's me. Glad to know I have fans already. When Izuku was sure that they were far enough away from the opening of the alley, he striked. A fan of yours. Well, he trailed off, and the boy must have finally noticed something off because he started to turn around, but was stopped by a hand around his throat, pinning him to the wall, leaving his feet flailing. Izuku let out a light laugh. Oh, you don't recognize me. I thought I left an impression. He briefly turned the skin void black like he was, before shifting back again. The boy was writhing pitifully in his grip, as recognition dawned on his face. Why your quicklash? Yes, Izuku cut him off, and I was so excited to see Katsuki that I didn't get anything to eat. What a shame. He spent no time killing the kid, because he most likely wasn't a hero student just for show, and Izuku wasn't going to take any chances. He hurried back home, greeted his mother, and hurried to bed, as it had been a long day. When Izuku woke up, it was his mother shaking him awake, saying that Mitsuki wanted Inko to come to hospital with her, and wondered if Izuku wanted to come as well. Izuku made sure he looked like his usual self, checking with his mother to make sure. They drove down to the hospital, and were greeted by a still-crying Mitsuki. Oh, I'm so glad you came. Katsuki went into some small surgery for his ear, but he'll be okay. Izuku took on the face of a worried friend. His ear. What happened to his ear? Mitsuki looked at Inko and said, You didn't tell him. Inko looked blankly at her, apparently not knowing what to say to that. Izuku turned to look at both women in confusion. Tell me what? Mitsuki looked hesitant as they were walking through the halls to Katsuki's room. Well, he claims that a villain there was claiming to be you and bit his ear off, she explained. Izuku let the shock fall onto his face. The villain did what? I would never hurt Kaken, not in a million years, he responded. Mitsuki ran a hand through her spiky hair, and huffed, Yeah, that's what I said, but he wouldn't listen to me. The doctors did say that he received a lot of blunt force trauma to the head, so that may have something to do with it. Izuku did panicked hand movements, but why would the villain claim to be me? What would they gain from that? He said. Mitsuki ruffled his hair. I don't know, kiddo, she sighed. Regardless, we're going to have to proceed with caution here. They stopped outside the door, with Izuku squished between the two women. Mitsuki opened the door and said, Katsuki, brat, someone's here to see you. Izuku got a good look at Katsuki, who had his head bandaged, and though he couldn't exactly see, he saw the dip in his ear. He inwardly smiled at that. Katsuki looked up and locked eyes with Izuku. He then started thrashing around, either trying to get up and attack him or run away. Get the F away from me, he yelled. Izuku held up his hands and forced himself to cower back. Kaken, what are you doing? He whimpered. Don't play that card with me, you little shit. I saw what you did. He roared. That villain wasn't me. I don't know what they told you, but I would never hurt you, Kaken. Bullshit. He shot back. No way, you wouldn't want revenge for what I did. Izuku let his angry tears run down his face, disguising it as hurt from his words. And no, Kaken. I forgive you, because you're going to be a great hero. No doubt. There hasn't been any doubt in my mind, even when we were kids. He ended. That seemed to calm Katsuki down, leaving only a suspicious stare in place of his explosive anger. Mitsuki seemed to relax from what Izuku realized was high-strung tension. Mitsuki went over to Katsuki's bed, and straightened the ruffled sheets on his bed. Inko walked over and planted a tentative kiss on his forehead. She got a grumble in return. Izuku walked over, eyes still slightly puffy, and sat down in a chair a little bit of distance from the bed. Kaken, what did the villain do? His eyes staring at his feet. Katsuki manages to scoff. Effer got the jump on me, that's what. He turned to the side facing away from Izuku. Izuku hid a small grin. Mitsuki said she was going to the cafeteria, and Inko decided to come along with her, leaving Katsuki and Izuku alone. Katsuki turned to him, suspicious glare and a scowl returning to his face. All right, Effer, don't try and effing play with me. I know what I heard and what I saw, he spat. Izuku sat and looked at him for a moment, appearing to try and comprehend what he said. Suddenly his eyes widened. Wait, what did you hear? Did the villain somehow say something personal? He turned away to mumble to himself. How would the villain know what to say to Kaken? Some sort of mind-reading quirk. But no, the most any current mind-reader quirk can do is only read the current thoughts, so unless he was all, he cut himself off with a hand over his mouth. Bakugo had an annoyed scowl, which only deepened as Izuku ranted. If you'd let me effing finish, then maybe I'll tell you. Izuku yelped and covered his mouth with both hands. The scowl lessened. That Effer is the reason those extras, fingers and wings, are dead. He spoke in an uncharacteristic quiet tone, as if he regretted whatever lousy thing he said to them. Interesting. Don't you effing dare tell this to anyone. His eyes pierced Izuku, and he didn't even try to suppress his shiver of delight, but rather masking it as fright. Oh, okay, Kaken, if you say so. Katsuki proceeded to take a deep breath, which showed Izuku just how shaken up he was. He started, that little shithead knew stalker-like info about me, and I called him out about the bullshit he was spouting, claiming that he was Deku. But a useless little freak like you doesn't even have a quirk. When he looked up at Izuku and saw that he was listening even though he saw a flinch, he continued. But that stupid son of a bitch threw Kirishima out of the damn wall of the effing building. That effer then got handsy on me, bit my ear off, and got off on it. When he stopped, he looked over to Izuku, who was still reeling. Why had Katsuki told him all that? He was pulled out of his trance by Katsuki saying, "Yeah, well, don't go spreading it around to every shithead you see." Izuku smiled kindly and said, "Man, you're so strong, Kaken. Anyone else's spirit might have been broken from something that traumatic, but you're still going." He paused, right. Katsuki looked barely affronted and instead responded with, "Hell yeah, I effing him, Deku." Izuku stayed silent for a couple of minutes, contemplating. Then, he said, "No offense should be taken, but why tell me something like that? I feel you would rather punch me for even insinuating anything about being friendly." He ended with an upward lilt to his voice. Katsuki was quiet for a moment, a long moment that frankly unnerved Izuku. "I've only been to UA for a few weeks, but my classmates are stupid effing leeches and not weak enough to be extras, and then they don't prove their place to people who deserve it." He huffed and looked down at his hands. "I started trying to be better for their sakes, and it was, effing." He looked up, trying to find the right word, relieving or some shit. "There was no, as my friends call it, walking around with a stick up my ass, which I don't get 'cause glasses has a effing tree branch or something." Izuku let out a startled laugh, surprised at his progress. "This is a good thing. It'll be all the more satisfying to see his face when he sees how badly he effed up. Glad to see you boys have made up." Mitsuki and Inko chose that time to make their reappearances. Izuku and his mother soon took their leave after that, heading home. A few unexciting days passed, and Izuku was out for a stroll. Nothing malicious or anything, just taking a walk. He was at the park, enjoying the spring weather. He closed his eyes and inhaled, picking out the different flower scents. He was so caught up in it that he didn't notice that someone was right in front of him until he bumped into them, knocking them both to the ground. Izuku opened his eyes and saw a kid about his age, with gravity-defying lavender hair and very prominent eye bags. He messily scrambled to his feet and hurried to help the boy up. "I am so sorry. I didn't watch where I was going." He laughed awkwardly, although it was probably bound to happen. I was walking on the main path, after all." The lavender-headed boy just stared up at him with wide eyes, as if he was surprised that someone was actually talking to him. He stared at the hand being offered, before realizing he should take it. A light blush appeared on his face as he took Izuku's hand. "Thanks." Izuku smiled like the sun. "No problem. Although I feel like I should do something to make it up to you." He ignored the hastily replied, "No, you don't have to," and dragged the boy to a nearby coffee shop. As they sat down at one of the outdoor tables, he kept his smile at the boy. "So, what's your name?" he asked. The boy snorted. "It's funny, you dragged me somewhere to make up for just bumping into me, and only now remember to ask my name." Izuku opened his mouth to respond, but the boy spoke again. "Shinsu. Shinsu Hitoshi, and you?" "My lovely savior from Gravel." Izuku rubbed his head sheepishly and answered, "Midoriya Izuku." Shinsu gave a small, near unnoticeable smile. An awkward silence befell them, and both of them inwardly scrambled to find any conversation topic. Shinsu finally settled on, "What school do you go to?" Izuku answered after a beat, I go to Aldera High. What about you?" Shinsu turned his head toward the TV in the cafe, still showing the news of the USJ. He turned back to Izuku, who had been watching him. He hesitated. "I go to UA, in general education." He started out. Izuku suddenly sat up straight from where he was leaning back in his chair, body language changing to enthusiastic, wherein before it was awkwardly interested. "Oh, that's so cool. Anyone who makes it to UA must be super cool," Izuku vocalized. Shinsu just responded, Thanks, I'm just trying to get into the hero course through the upcoming sports festival, because they say that it has happened before." He shyly mumbled out the last part. Izuku smiled and said, "Okay, I'll be cheering for you then. Let's exchange numbers and be friends." He quickly froze and turned beet red, and quickly backtracked, I mean, only if you want to. I didn't mean to assume." "Oh, I've screwed thigh, hey, don't worry about it," Shinsu cut in. "I thought it was a nice idea." It was Shinsu's turn to blush. They exchanged numbers and went on their way. Izuku was unsure of when he had ever made a friend on his own, and he smiled goofily for the rest of the way home. Shinsu thought back to that conversation he had just had. He thought it had gone better than he assumed it would. The boy he met, Midoriya, was so kind to him. He didn't even say his quirk. It was just pathological kindness. Or at least, he thought it was. He knew himself to be good at reading people. It was kind of necessary, after all. A few more days passed, until it was finally time for the UA Sports Festival. Izuku sat in the bar, with Shigaraki and Kirigiri. He was slumped over in his seat, elbows on the bar, waiting for the festival to start. Izuku huffed, and said to Kirigiri, "Give me something as dark and bitter as my soul. Please," he added on. He didn't bother to look beside him when Shigaraki snorted. Kirigiri responded, "Of course." "Here," and Izuku looked over and watched as the man placed a glass of chocolate milk in front of him. Beside him, Shigaraki cackled. Izuku frowned, looking up at Kirigiri. "Come on, my soul is darker than that," he told him. The misty bartender looked at him for a moment, before putting more chocolate syrup into his glass and mixing it. Izuku studied it for a second, and then he smiled brightly. Perfect. He sipped his milk happily, quietly humming a nameless tune. The festival started, and Izuku watched as the obstacle race went on, and Katsuki fought head-to-head with the red and white-haired boy. Soon enough, the obstacle race ended in that boy, Todoroki, he believes, taking first. He got 10 million points on his head, and in the team-up that followed, his team managed to keep almost the entire game, only to lose at the last second to a girl that Izuku thought looked like a frog. And then, the part Izuku had been waiting for, the one-on-one battles. Oh, he was so excited. He was pretty far from both of the other occupants of the bar. He knew what was going to happen, as it happened nearly every year since middle school. He brought down one of his hands and lightly palmed himself, and used his other hand to cover his mouth. The first fight started, and it was Shinsu against a boy with a copy quirk. Shinsu merely spoke, and Izuku watched the other respond, and then fall slack, walking out of the ring himself. Oh, that was so hot. He didn't even care that there wasn't any actual fighting happening. The fights went on, and Izuku, who completely ached as each fight happened, was trying not to rut against the counter. He was using his own hand to massage himself as well. He let out soft whines, barely covered by his hand, and then hurriedly excused himself to go to the bathroom when he couldn't handle it anymore. He closed the door behind him and locked it. He then sunk to the floor onto his knees. Oh, he hastily unzipped his pants and grabbed his D. Just one pump was all it took for him to come all over the floor. But he was so achingly hard again, and so he replayed those fights over in his head. Izuku's eternally glad that the walls are soundproof, because he couldn't stop the pleasured mons from slipping out. He could hear faint explosions coming from the TV. He knew exactly who it was, then. He nearly fell face forward as he cupped his S and gave his CCK a hard squeeze. He came for a second and third time, nearly growling. His eyes rolled to the back of his head as his back arched and his tongue flicked out, forked and thin, smelling the salt-tinted air. He let a shiver rack his body, with his fingers resting on the floor in a claw-like manner. Wow, he's definitely never had this extreme of a reaction before. He gave in to the urge to let himself grow into the creature, still small enough to fit in the bathroom. Izuku was near feral, and knew it was going to be loud, so he found a metal hand bar attached to the wall, and clamped his mouth around it as he made himself come once again. The amount of pleasure was mind-boggling, especially when he was the creature. It was so much more than him as a human. He could feel the rightness of it as it coursed through his veins. He knew he was at his end for now, and shifted back to look human. It was more difficult than he was expecting. He cleaned up his mess on the floor as well as himself. That's when he looked at the handbar and saw it completely twisted and crushed. He was slightly surprised at his strength once more, relishing in his firsts. A small smile grew on his face as he unlocked the door, and told Kurogiri and Shigaraki that he was leaving. Kurogiri bade his goodbye, and Shigaraki just nodded at him, which Izuku figured was the best he was going to get. He walked out of the bar instead of using Kurogiri, because he figured he'd need a walk after that. Izuku was relishing in the lingering euphoria. He walked through alleyways, enjoying the evening weather. There weren't many people about, due to the masses being at the UA Sports Festival. Izuku walked toward a common villain meeting point, which was a kind of neutral turf for villains and thugs alike. It was about the size of a city block, and he knew he'd entered it when there were people lingering around, watching him cautiously as he passed them. Some people even flattened themselves against the walls of buildings as he walked by. His villain alias was rather infamous, and was among the top dogs of the place. But Izuku liked it when people underestimate him, so he could show them their place when they try something. New people came into the place all the time. Yet not a lot of these people had seen him face to face, and people tend to exaggerate. He got to the center hub, where there were dozens of people milling around. The center hub was a casual restaurant called Cadillac, and when many regulars laid eyes on him, they widened their eyes and took a few hasty steps backward, parting the crowd to let him through. The other regulars who didn't see him took that as a cue to move out of the way as well. That's where the newbies were made obvious, as they didn't know the danger they were in. He loves all these wondrous coincidences. For another old classmate of his was here with his brother, who recognized him and stepped back. The classmate of his looked confused and turned around, only to spot Izuku. Unfortunately for him, he ignored the wrongness of the atmosphere around him and started talking. What, are you all scared of a stupid effing Deku? He's nothing but a worthless, quirkless, degenerate. The boy turned around to look at Deku, who had, with a small smile, an otherwise neutral look on his face. What the F do you think you're doing in a goddamn villain hub? Did you get lost on your way home to mommy? He taunted. Izuku could hear everyone else suck in a breath, horrified at what they were hearing. There were so many different moods that Izuku was in, when he periodically entered, that these people had a right to be nervous, especially when he's never made it obvious until he spoke. Izuku made a show of licking his lips and putting a look of wine in his eye, letting others know that, though he was in a good mood, that didn't mean it was a good thing. The boy finally ran out of derogatory remarks and suddenly looked around at the wide circle that had been made by the surrounding people. The boy smirked and exclaimed, "Look at that. They even want a show of me putting down a worthless runt like you." Finally, Izuku opened his mouth and spoke softly. "Is that really what you want? You can always back down now and nothing will have to happen here." The brother frantically tried to call his brother back behind a wall of people, but he was ignored. The boy didn't hear the obvious warning and shouted, "If that's a challenge, I ain't backing down, you little shit." Instead of a neutral look, Izuku suddenly pinned the boy with a stare, and watched with giddy as the boy nearly froze in place. He looked off to the right, to see his brother crouching down, mumbling what seemed to be a prayer. The others saw his line of sight and was confirmed by a nod of his of what they needed to do. One of the larger men took the brother by his scruff and tossed him like a rag doll into the circle. The brother was whimpering pitifully on the ground. The boy scowled at his brother. What the F are you crying about, dude? It's just Deku, that worthless bass says stop talking. You're only making it worse. The brother cried out. A small chuckle interrupted their conversation, and both boys froze and slowly turned their heads toward Izuku, whose smile was getting wider and continued to his seams and his cheeks parted as well. The brother shook with despair, and no. Please, he begged, head on the ground. Izuku laughed, a wicked, distorted sound coming out of his mouth, with the entirety of his jaw split. Oh, don't worry, I'll barely even touch high. The brother let out a huge sigh of relief, but froze as he realized the implications of what was just said. Izuku took a moment to look over at the boy, who was beginning to realize how majorly he fed up. Izuku leaned his arms forward and bent down to a crouch, arms dangling and in front of him. His hands were shifting and becoming more jagged. The rest of his body followed suit. He took his time to transform into the creature up to about the size of a first-story house. He relished the increasing terror on the boy's face as he grew, and he decided to play with his food first. Really, the only reason he's doing this instead of just ending it quickly is because he knows the people around him often get bored, so he likes to give them a good show. It's also a good way to live up to his reputation. His eyes raked up and down his body, remembering him to be the kid with large teeth ... or something. Izuku licked his lips, showing off a forked tongue that was very long. Oh, pardon me, I forgot to introduce myself. The creature spoke, its mouth only slightly moving as it did. The boy quivered under his stare and sank to his knees. Izuku proceeded to put his head between the two brothers mere feet away. My name, he looked at his former classmate, is Quirkless. He twisted his neck and in one swift motion, bit off the brother's head. Blood and viscera dripped from his teeth, and he growled in appreciation of a nice snack. He looked over at his classmate, flicking some blood off his teeth and onto the boy. That gained a flinch. He went back down and tore open the chest cavity and devoured the heart. The creature rippled like water, and it appeared bigger. Some of the other newbies couldn't hold their stomachs. It was hilarious. Izuku's form melted into shadow and swirled around the boy, slowing down until it floated at ear level. Welcome to villainy, he cackled, distorting the air itself, and flew to the front of the door, letting the shadow take shape into himself. One of the thugs near the door scrambled to open the door for him. As he walked through the door, the barista gave him a warm greeting, and he reciprocated. It was as if he hadn't just bitten off someone's head. He sat in the corner of the room, so he was able to see all angles without having to watch his back. A waitress came over and asked his order. He wanted a nice, cool black tea to wash down the pieces of brain still stuck in his teeth. Some of the villains walked in, cautiously watching and waiting for Izuku to do something. Izuku relished in his own total authority over them. He sat back in his chair and gave the most innocent smile he could muster. You're good, he chirped. The newbies who walked in after the others froze in place. All of them were collectively thinking, what the F? Excuse me, is this seat taken? Izuku looked at the man whom he'd been watching over a few minutes now. It was obvious that the man had been gathering up his courage to come and speak to him. And wasn't that a sight? Izuku smiled and gestured for him to take a seat. Though the man was wearing a mask, he looked thankful. Yes, is there any reason you're sitting here instead of anywhere else? Izuku asked. The masked man chuckled nervously. I've heard through the grapevine that you're part of the League of Villains. Izuku blinked, not expecting this. Well, he wasn't sure what he was expecting. And you want in, then? Izuku responded, a knowing look in his eyes. The man tipped his bowler hat. Glad to see my intentions have been made clear, he told Izuku, who didn't see any harm in adding this due to their lovely chaotic crew. Izuku shrugged, not to be rude, but what's your quirk? He looked at the man. Said man held up a gloved finger. Ah yes, I'm known as Mr. Compress, for my ability to shrink anything into a small, crystal-like. Izuku was impressed. He'd make a good member of the league. Alrighty then, Izuku took a napkin, and used the pen that he always kept on him to write down the address of the bar. He slid it over to Mr. Compress and told him, when you get in there, tell Shiggy that Quirkless sent you there. And it's important that you say Shiggy, so that he figures it's not someone pretending to be me. Compress took the napkin and stood up and gave a low bow. My thanks, he said, as he walked out the door of the restaurant. Izuku was pretty content with the situation and took another look around the room. He loves reactions, so he slowly stood up. Not enough to be noticed right away, but enough that some of the patrons looked his way. He could honestly see why Katsuki liked attention so much. It was kind of addicting. A clear path was spread out for him, except for this one dude who was in his way, so he gently pushed him aside. And by gently, he means no physical harm was done and he just cleared his throat. The man gulped and scurried out of the way. Izuku continued to wander the streets, and he eventually found his way home. He opened the door to see his mother. Inko fussed over him. Are you okay? You were gone for a while, and I was getting worried. Izuku smiled and hugged her. Don't worry, I just had a light snack, he said. Inko didn't comment. The rest of the evening passed, and Izuku was happy to see that Shinsu got third place in the sports festival. He sent a quick congratulations to him on his phone, and got a smiley face in return. He soon got ready for bed and went to sleep, excited for the days to come. It was a few days later, when walking into a cafe, that Izuku made another friend. There was a lovely cat cafe down the street from where he lived. He decided, with nothing better to do, that he would check it out. He walked into the cafe and requested an hour. He paid for his time slot and turned around to find a seat. From there, he spotted a boy about his age sitting by himself by the window. He settled his nerves of making new friends, telling himself he's done it before. He walked to the booth and spoke, "Excuse me, would it be okay if I sat here?" The boy looked up, his blank expression changing into one of simple perplexion. "Why?" was the boy's response. "Ah," Izuku thought, a man of few words. He clapped his hands together gently and said, "Well, I'd like to be friends with you." He closed his eyes in what he thought looked like wishful hope. The boy's eyes stayed blank. "We've literally never met." "Again, why?" he countered, starting to look slightly miffed. Izuku hastily made movements to backtrack, and "No, I'm sorry for maybe pushing you." But he looked down and poked his fingers together. "I've just been trying to make some friends lately, now that I'm out of middle school," he finished. The blank look he received lightened a little bit, and he counted it as a success. "Sure," the boy said, "I don't mind." Izuku smiled brightly, glad at making another friend. That was a record, he thought. He sat down across from the boy and asked him, "Hi, I'm Midoriya Izuku. It's nice to meet you." The boy looked increasingly relaxed, and it was even better that a cat chose that moment to jump into his lap. "Todoroki Shadow. It is nice to meet you as well." The cat in his lap was purring and headbutting him, and Izuku could see the small smile that graced Todoroki's face. Izuku left his phone on the seat and got up to find some cats. He went over to his left a little, where there were more cats around. He crouched down and held out his hand, beckoning some cats toward him. All the cats in that immediate area dispersed like he was covered in cat repellent. Izuku frowned, slightly confused. Then, it hit him. Oh, Izuku concentrated for a moment, and then, from deep in his throat, he successfully started purring. At first, one brave cat slowly tread up to him, and hesitantly sniffed the hand he was holding out, before rubbing its head against it. This was the cue for the other cats to suddenly swarm him with attention, meowing for pets. He laughed and fell on his butt, and a particularly driven cat used that opportunity to worm its way into his lap. He gently picked it up as he himself stood. Izuku walked back over to the table, cat in hand, and once more sat down across from Todoroki. The cat seemed very pleased about the extra attention given to it. Izuku looked at the collar and saw that its name was Cinderblock. He thought it was a fitting name for a spotted gray cat. Todoroki looked vaguely impressed, all the while holding the first cat in his lap. A waitress then came by to take their order. Izuku ordered a strawberry shortcake while Todoroki ordered some cold soba. The two boys proceeded to make small talk as they pet their respective cats. Izuku was ecstatic to have made another friend, and also surprised that Todoroki went to UA as well. Izuku repeated what he told Shinsu, and said that he went to Aldera High School, which he did but mostly for the experience of high school, since he'd already tested out of all the classes. Izuku was almost surprised when his hour was up, and he shyly bid Todoroki goodbye. Just like with Shinsu, they exchanged numbers as well. As Izuku was walking back, he made what he didn't know was a life-changing decision. He went onto his phone and created a group chat with Shinsu and Todoroki. "Midoriya Izuku, hey my lovely friends. I've made a group chat. Since y'all go to the same school, you oughta know each other. Todoroki Shadow, don't you mean oughta? Midoriya Izuku. Shinsu Hitoshi, yes we kinda know each other. Hi Todoroki. Todoroki Shadow, hi Shinsu. Midoriya Izuku, no. We gotta make nicknames. Todoroki Shadow, alright." Todoroki Shadow changed Midoriya Izuku's name to Green Bean. Shinsu Hitoshi, I approve. Green Bean, okay. My turn. Green Bean changed Shinsu Hitoshi's name to Eyebags. Eyebags, why? Green Bean, 'cause I like much about you but you have big eye bags so I think you need to sleep more. 8 Sleepy Boy, it's your turn. Eyebags changed Todoroki Shadow's name to Zuko Light. Green Bean, amazing. Wondrous. I'm not being sarcastic. Zuko Light, I don't get it. Eyebags, oh no. Green Bean, Eyebags, oh no. Green Bean, Eyebags, what have you done? Green Bean, what? What do you mean you do anti-get IT? Zuko Light, did you really have to type all that out? Green Bean, yes. Also we need to all get together and watch Avatar, The Last Airbender. I am PR additive. Zuko Light, I'll have soba and then I'm good. Eyebags, mochai. Green Bean, all of the above. Zuko Light, deal. Eyebags, deal. Green Bean, Izuku has been feeling as though he's been far too busy lately, so he decided to go to the park. Granted, it was kind of impulsive since he didn't really know what he was going to do at the park. But that cluelessness went away when he sat down in the grass next to a bush with a bunch of caterpillars attached to it. He held out his finger and a big, chunky green boy inched its way on. He smiled at the caterpillar's lack of survival instincts as he enjoyed the feeling of an animal coming up to him without him having to coax it. Other caterpillars followed the first one's example and made their way toward him. He started playfully beatboxing for a self-proclaimed caterpillar rave. And that's how Shinsu found him, sitting cross-legged in the middle of the grass covered in caterpillars of all colors, giggling like a dork, and trying to beatbox but ultimately failing. Shinsu didn't know how a person could emit such brightness naturally. Hi Shinsu-kun. He didn't realize that he had zoned out, and nor did he know how long he'd been standing there, but clearly for enough of a time for the green-haired boy to notice his presence. Shinsu smiled and waved his hand in greeting. Hey Midoriya. There was a bright smile on his face as he said, look. I found these thick boy caterpillars. He raised his hand to show the multiple caterpillars curled around his hand. See, we've been having a rave. He wiggled his fingers, slightly jostling the insects, and leaned backwards until he was splayed out on the grass. His hair blended in with the grass, and Shinsu thought he would be good at hide and seek if he hid in a bush. Izuku smiled wide, and Shinsu wondered how wide a smile could get, before assuming it was probably his quirk or something. You could never know. There are weirder things out there. Shinsu realized that he was zoning out again when Izuku tugged on his hand, off-balancing him, and making him fall over on top of him. Shinsu's face landed in the crook of Izuku's neck, which in point made Shinsu turn a bright scarlet before rolling over on this side and onto the grass. There was a small giggle coming from the green-haired boy, and it somehow made Shinsu feel just a little less embarrassed. The group of friends did indeed get together for their marathon, and there was indeed cold soba for Todoroki and matcha for Shinsu. However, Izuku may have made a small mistake. See, everything was going fine, with Izuku lighting up at the sight of Haibai, the panda forest spirit. However, things started going wrong when they got to the backstory of Zuko. There was the Agni Kai scene, the fight between Prince Zuko and his father, that really emphasized how much Izuku might have messed up. Truth be told, they had to pause it. Todoroki fell to the floor, breathing heavily, and clutching the left side of his face, as if he were reliving some awful pain. Izuku realized that he didn't warn his friends of any triggers the show might involve. Izuku kneeled beside Todoroki and drew small circles on his shoulder blades. It visibly calmed him to the point where he was out of hyperventilation. I'm so sorry. I didn't think to mention the possible trigger warnings of the show. Izuku frantically told him. Oh no, I've messed this up. Now you guys won't want to hang out with me anymore. I'm sorry I made you relive something you'd rather forget. You don't have to be friends with me anymore if you don't want to. You'd probably be a lot happier with more time on your hands anyway. I know it's so much true. Both Shinsu and Todoroki simultaneously put their hands on Izuku's mouth, cutting off his anxious rant. Todoroki, who seemed to have calmed down, looked at him with fond exasperation, a ghost of a smile on lips. It's not your fault, you couldn't have known this would happen. Shinsu had the same expression as Todoroki. I know what it's like to be alone, and I know that neither Todoroki nor I would leave you by yourself over a mistake. It was reassuring to know that both boys didn't see the act of friendship expendable like everyone in his middle school did. Also, both boys didn't mention that as Izuku ranted, the shadows of the room became longer and more jagged. About 2 days later, while Shinsu and Todoroki were off doing their internships, Izuku decided to visit the villain hub again, but this time, without causing a big show like last time. Well, maybe. He made it to the edge of the territory, before shifting his person into one similar to his first disguise. With red eyes and long black hair over one, Izuku just looked like an edgy teenager who didn't know what he was getting himself into. With his hands stuffed in the pockets, he strode into the block, making his demeanor that of nervousness. He was surprised that he wasn't accosted by anyone on his way to Kataylor, but when he got to the entrance he could see why. It seemed that even though the crowd was fairly large, word didn't spread around, because of what he assumed was fear at what happened, or respect for whoever caused it. So there were a bunch of people surrounding the carcass of his shitty former classmate's brother. He walked up to it, and saw a surprising amount of newbies in the surrounding crowd, murmuring to each other. The seasoned ones just looked on at the scene with exasperation. Izuku walked around it, and into Kataylor, where he went to a different table than he usually did. He was feeling agitated, and he needed something to blow off some steam. He watched as a whole crowd of newbies made their way in. Luckily, Kataylor was by no means a small restaurant, so they easily fit. He subtly shifted his face back to normal, before leaning back in his chair, stretching out his limbs and yawning loudly. It caught the attention of most of the people in that side of the restaurant. Out of the corner of his eye, Izuku could see the irritation on the new group's face. One guy, who seemed to act as their leader, got up and sauntered over to where Izuku was sitting. Oi, noob. It took a moment for Izuku to realize that someone was talking to him. He turned around and looked up at the man, who seemed to try and look intimidating, and it would have worked on any lesser being. He stopped and stared for a moment, and then responded, What? You look new around here, and I thought I'd let you know some ground rules. We've been around here for 2 or 3 weeks, had he really been gone for that long. And we've established our place at the top and no one has said otherwise. But then you come in and sit at our table, thinking you own the place. So we've come to set you straight. Izuku let out a snort, before it turned into full-on laughter. The man in front of him looked agitated. Oi, the F are you laughing at? As soon as those words left his lips, Izuku's laughter cut off abruptly. In a slightly louder voice, he called out, Yuki-san. Could you get me some sweet tea? The dude standing in front of him blinked at the non-sequitur. Of course, senpai. The leader looked down on him with incredulous eyes. Senpai, who the hell are you? Izuku changed his hair color back to green, cluing in the surrounding regulars as to who he is. Within half a second, every one of them scrambled backwards in an attempt to get away from him. He smiled. I'll admit, I haven't been here in a few weeks. He raised his voice a little louder, but that doesn't mean you automatically pick someone new. I'm hurt. He held his hand up to his heart in a gesture of mock hurt. Most of the patrons shrunk away, and what the new gang could see was primal fear. Maybe you should listen to rumors before sauntering up like you own the place. He directed his focus back on the gang leader, who looked wary but still didn't really know what was going on. Abruptly, Izuku turned his back to walk out the door. Everyone else all but pushed the gang out the door behind him, so it was just him and the leader, with the gang off to the side to spectate. Izuku stopped walking at the headless corpse that was still there from a few weeks ago, and seeked his head to the side. This shouldn't still be here. Are you guys getting lazy? He asked no one in particular. Without bothering to wait for a response, he kicked it off to the side. Izuku turned around and walked up to the man, who was a lot taller than he was, and introduced himself. Hi, my name is Akatani Izuku, but my villain name is, well, that's up for you to guess. He smiled wide with razor-sharp teeth as the gang leader paled. And now, what do you think? He continued. Are you that villain with the elastic limbs that strangles people? The leader asked. Izuku sighed and shook his head. If you hadn't guessed already, that villain was only a lower C-class according to police files. I'm not a C-class. He could see the other gang members murmuring in the background. Is he insinuating that he's B-class or even lower class? Izuku's smile was wide. You aren't quite right either. He stepped back and held his arms out wide. You've run out of guesses and I'm getting impatient. My villain name is one I devised myself, you see, and well, not many of the general public are privy to it. His smile dropped down to a scowl. Actually, I've heard they just put All Might on my case. He easily pushed the dude off his feet, and the rest of the crowd gasped. And you had the gall to call me a noob. Leaning down to the man's sweaty face, he said, loud enough for others to hear, my name is S-Class Villain. Quirklash. He licked his lips and grabbed a hold of the man's shirt, before disappearing away from the crowd, and into some back alley nearby. The man's back impacted the brick wall of the alleyway harshly, and Izuku shivered in delight. Izuku's eyes were blown wide, staring down at his soon-to-be victim. The man was quivering like gelatin. You hear the Quirklash-sama. There were still other people around, but they knew when it wasn't their place to meddle. Izuku's smile was wicked as he licked his lips, obviously salivating. The man scrambled to get away, but that proved to make the situation worse as he scraped his back on the concrete and brick he was pressed against. It wasn't a light scrape either, since there was blood soaking the back of his shirt. Izuku's nostrils flared at the smell. Hungry, he growled. The man was muttering, shit, 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 over and over again as he accepted the cold dread in his stomach, weighing him down even more. The man's eyes were blown wide in terror, sweat dripped down his face as if in slow motion. Izuku's head was suddenly at the man's left arm, and he bit down hard. The man screamed and cried as the tendons in his arm barely held onto his shoulder, which was now almost entirely gone. Izuku could never get tired of this. The years of suppressing himself were showing its consequences, as he moaned at the heavenly taste of what was pure ambrosia on his tongue. Along with that, the man's screams were doing something to him. He stuck his hands into the blood pooling on the ground under him, and lifted them back up to look at the crimson sheen of his hands. He stuck his long tongue out and licked the blood clean from his fingers. The man, who had been screaming pretty much this whole time, had finally stopped being so loud. His teeth were stained red, and blood ran down his chin. He smiled down at the pathetic form of the man, showing too many teeth than should be possible. Soft, broken sobs were emanating from the man. Please, let me live. Izuku laughed and grabbed the man's mangled shoulder and wrenched it from the socket. The resulting scream was louder than the last, and the people nearby were growing visibly uncomfortable. Because even though most of them were villains, they were forced into that role by society. Izuku was different from them. Yes, he may have been shaped into it, but it was inevitable from the beginning. Unfortunately, the man's scream was heard beyond those in the hub. Izuku smelled them coming, and turned to his disguise from when he'd just gotten there, before the person at his feet screwed it up. He jumped out of the way just in time for Death Arms himself to split the concrete where he'd been previously standing. Just as he'd landed in a crouch, he jumped again, not giving any time for the hero to recover. Death Arms punched at him again, and again Izuku nimbly dodged, all the while subtly leading the hero away from Khanivore. A hero was finally chasing him. Lucky for him, then. He smirked, and decided that yes, his boredom has finally led him far enough to taunt a hero. It's about time a hero found me. I was starting to think you all were a bunch of incompetent D-heads. He pretended to think about it. Oh wait, you are. Izuku giggled like a small child at the face of the hero. As he did so, he easily navigated through the twists and turns of the alleyways. Death Arms yelled out, "Oi, watch your mouth, kid. Just cooperate with me and we can get this over with without any trouble," he said. Probably just as a protocol that's necessary before beating the shit out of a villain. Izuku CC'd his head to the side. "Ooh, I get it. You don't even know who I am." He jumped onto the fire escape on a nearby building. The hero looked up at him and scowled in annoyance. Does it matter? A villain is a villain. He responded, looking like he was trying to figure out a way to get up to Izuku without causing too much property damage. Izuku bent his knees in preparation. But that's where you're wrong, he said before he disappeared from the hero's view. Death Arms felt a light weight on his shoulder before his head was put in a headlock. Tell me, Dakusubate Shida, what does it matter if there's a villainous thug on the street purse snatching or if there's villains like me whom the government refuses to put on public television, only to keep on a watch list and to not announce it, eh? He tightened his grip, barely moving as Death Arms tried to pry off Izuku's arms. The hero's complexion whitened the tiniest bit as a small amount of fear radiated off him. How did this villain know his civilian name? And what did he say about the HPSC watch list? Only the most dangerous villains appear there without a public announcement. Usually because if a villain gets that big they'd announce themselves. Death Arms' face continued to pale, both from fear and asphyxiation. Izuku leaned in to whisper in the hero's ear, "Congratulations, you get to be the first hero I've killed." He struggled harder, but stopped and fell limp, his hands dropping from where he was trying to pry Izuku off of him, as a large spike from nowhere impaled him through the head. He fell forward, with Izuku on top of him. Though Izuku wasn't transformed, he still had his razor-sharp tail. He looked back at it. Didn't know I could do that, he said to himself. But I'm still hungry. He turned to look at the prone body of the hero. Licking his lips, he feasted. Izuku retracted his tail to go wherever it went. As he ate, his form shifted, but he refused to transform right now. As he ate the heart of the hero, even though he refused to transform, Izuku's body grew more symbiotic, writhing and shaking in the air for a moment. After about a minute, he shakily reformed, letting out a pleasured gasp. Wow, he should have started going after heroes a while ago. The power he felt after that was a major adrenaline boost. That excess energy also went somewhere else, but he ignored it. Tsukachi Naomasa, the lead detective on the what's come to be known as the Soul Stealer case, put his face in his hands and contemplated quitting then and there. It had started around a year ago, and Tsukachi was hoping that it was some B or even a rank villain that they would catch within a few weeks. It wasn't. Tsukachi knew that he had always had the shittier luck in their department. It was a well-known fact, actually. But this was getting ridiculous. Unlike the majority of the villains they deal with, this particular one never announced themselves. Though it was easy to tell when they started, or at least, they hoped it was as clear-cut as it seemed. Around 14 months ago, a local middle school teacher was found completely exsanguinated. He looked so much like a raisin that they wouldn't have recognized him as human were it not for the stench. There was the letter Q written on the wall next to the body. Their first thought was the notorious serial killer, Toga Himiko, even with the slight evidence against it. But even that lasted for a day before they found the next two bodies. Two third-year middle school students from the same school as the previous victim. The only reason they connected it to the same killer as before is the U written on the wall and the victim's blood. It was starting to look less and less like a coincidence from every angle it was looked at. But this wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was that, unlike the first one, instead of being completely drained of blood, these two bodies were mutilated. Their chests were splayed open like a torture method of the Viking era known as the Viking blood eagle. Their ribs were splayed out, and when officers looked in the empty space that was their chest, it was just that, empty. Their hearts were gone. That's how the killer was nicknamed the Soul Stealer. While not on a clear-cut basis of what the hearts themselves were used for, the theory with the most concrete evidence behind it was that, given the bite marks on each body, the killer ate them. Even the more experienced officers lost their lunches with that bit of information. Whoever this killer was, they were dangerous. They just couldn't announce something so horrific to the general public. It would cause an uneasy stir in the masses. From then on, a victim with the same method of being killed, tortured, were found every week for the next 10 months. It was awful. An eternal hopeless feeling had started to swell in his gut. It was only after a few kills that they finally got the last killer's self-proclaimed alias, quirkless. To be honest, it was an unusual name, and none of the psychology experts could interpret the name's meaning. It was way out of left field. But now that there was a concrete name, everyone on the case couldn't help but shiver with rising terror. The Soul Stealer, quirkless. About a month ago, their kill pattern changed slightly. Then the USJ happened. They had nothing. No information on this new group of villains whatsoever. But the beast that showed up there, All Might said he had met the beast before. Not as a beast, but as a child. All Might was unable to explain further at that point, but Tsukachi had a feeling that it was significant. Along with the rest of the main villains that showed up, the kid and his quirk wasn't in the quirk registry, and that gave them an edge. Then, Death Arms was found dead yesterday. His body showed the same signs of the Soul Stealer. The anticipation had been rising, as the killer wasn't killing for about 4 weeks. But they weren't getting their hopes up like they had before the USJ. And they were right. That's how they found the hero. There wasn't as much brutality as many of the other murders, but his heart was missing. Though the obvious cause of death was the large hole in his head, and the rope-like bruises around his throat, presumably where he'd been locked in a headlock. This is the first hero that Quicklash has gone after. Tsukachi was certain that it was most definitely not the last. Izuku felt restless, and he needed a victim or two to satiate his hunger. His mother has been affected too, he noticed. Sometimes his responses would come out as an irritated-sounding growl that would make Inko flinch. He would usually apologize, but sometimes he wouldn't, and it was getting more and more frequent. He was hanging out with Shinsu and Todoroki so much lately, and he needed to get away from them for a little while. It became harder and harder for him to act human around them. And they were smart, so they'd get suspicious sooner or later. Izuku decided that it's been a while since he went after anyone from Aldera, and he decided to go after his phys ed teacher, who had insisted that most days would be the entire class against quirkless Izuku and Dodge. Izuku smiled at the awful memory. It was payback time. It only took him a mere 36 hours to locate the whereabouts of his former sensei. And when he did, he followed him through downtown Hasu, where it was as crowded as it would get on a sunny night. It was in the middle of the crowd of people that he did his best to ignore that something went slightly awry. The man he was following noticed him. The man turned around, gave what he probably thought was a hidden smirk, and shoved Izuku into a small side alley. Well, the quirkless bug decided to show his face again. Izuku didn't deign to give this dude a response, but instead, he let himself be grabbed by the neck and knocked over onto the ground. The man looked down at Izuku with a grin on his face. "Man, it must be my lucky day," he said, using the hand that wasn't holding Izuku's neck to fiddle with the zipper on his jeans. Izuku frowned. He was willing to let some superiority thing this dude had to play out, but he wasn't about to go that far. "Didn't know my middle school sensei was such a pedophile." The man squeezed his neck, like that was going to do anything to him. "You set your trap, scum." The man spat at him. Izuku then grabbed the hand on his neck, crushing it. The man was so loud, geez. Izuku quickly leapt up, and soon enough the man was the one on the ground, with Izuku holding his neck in an actual death grip. Izuku was ecstatic to finally have some food. "Well, looky here. It seems the tables have turned," he said. The man must have sensed Izuku's blood, because he shrank back. That action made Izuku croon in delight. "Oh, little birdie is afraid. You better be." His form rippled, and while nothing seemed to change at first, it slowly became apparent as to what had happened. He lunged down, taking a bite of the man's collarbone area, making the man squirm and give out muffled screams. The red eyes were so blissed out as they rolled to the back of Izuku's head. Finally, some food. Izuku shuddered and took another bite, this time at the man's head, so he would just shut up. He soon got bored though, because he liked it when they squirmed. But he was just so hungry, and it took him no time to completely eat the man. But he needed more, and that problem was soon solved when he heard a gasp come from his left, further down the alley. His head swiveled in that direction, and he laid eyes on a woman who had seen him. He leapt at her, faster than she could move, quickly immobilizing her. He held down her head with large claws. She let out a small scream, right before he quickly covered her mouth. Izuku decided to briefly reminisce by taking her wrist up to his mouth and licking it with a forked tongue. A shudder racked his frame, and it compelled him to sink his fangs into the woman's bony wrist. He gulped down the blood like he was dying of thirst. His hands clawed at the woman's face as his eyes rolled to the back of his head in ecstasy. He moaned as blood ran down his lips and onto his chin. Once he was finished with the blood, he moved on to the body itself. His rational mind was absent, and his eyes fogged up, as he followed the pleasure that his body desired. He let go of the hand holding the woman's mouth, as she'd quickly gone slack in his grip. He then used that hand to dig into the corner of her eye socket, plucking out her eye and detaching it from where it was connected to her brain. He looked at it but for the briefest of seconds, and then popped it into his mouth as if it were a grape. A new kind of flavor flooded his taste buds. He couldn't get enough. He did the same thing with the other eye. It only took him about 10 minutes, but he made quick work of her. He was about to finish her heart off, when he heard labored breathing and his head snapped in that direction. He didn't quite see who it was, but instead reacted on instinct and tackled the person to the ground. His clawed hands were drenched in blood and viscera, so was his face. Izuku knew he looked as part of the villain to whoever had stumbled upon him. He held the person's shoulders down, but not their neck, as he wasn't about to kill them immediately. As he licked his lips, his tongue flared out from his mouth, longer than it's ever been. Izuku was miffed that he didn't get to finish his meal and gave a menacing growl at the person. However, when ice started to form at the edge of his vision, he knew something was wrong. His eyes cleared from their fogginess and, with dawning horror, he recognized the person in front of him. He scrambled off of them, and landed low to the ground in a crouch. Izuku was unable to stand up as he normally would, however, as his back legs had an extra joint. Todoroki, he realized. The ice stopped forming as the now-named Todoroki comprehended who was in front of him. He was in what seemed to be a hero's outfit, eyes wide and seeming to be in a rush. Todoroki distractedly brushed his hands against his chest, yet not clearly comprehending the crimson of the blood on his hand. He spoke in a dazed manner. "Midoriya." He shook his head rapidly. I don't. I'll ask later. Right now, I need help finding this place." He held up his phone to Izuku, who saw that it was a location just a few alleys away. Izuku's head tilted to the side, like a dog being told an order from the wrong owner. Then, he sniffed the air and could smell others' blood nearby. He darted off in that direction, with Todoroki on his heel. The scene he found was a surprising one. Izuku saw the hero killer, Stain, about to finish off another hero student with engines in his legs, and off to the side, Shinsu, who looked like he was unable to move. He made a quick assumption that neither student wanted this kid to die, so he lunged at the blade above the kid's neck. The villain holding the blade hurriedly stepped back as a feral-looking gremlin kid tried to bite his sword in half. Todoroki made himself known as he ran up to the scene, out of breath. There were slight yelps of surprise when Shinsu and later Iida saw the amount of blood on Todoroki. "It's not mine," he reassured them. Todoroki went over to help Shinsu up, and as he did, he whispered in his ear, "It's Midoriya." Shinsu sucked in an alarmed breath, his head whipping around to stare at the now identified Midoriya. He couldn't tell before, but now that he's seen it, he can't unsee it. Their friend seemed so gentle, before. But now that he was covered head to toe with blood, with his usual green eyes ablaze in red and his tongue long like that pre-Quirk movie Venom, he looked positively feral. He didn't look human. Quirk or not, this was something else. Izuku croaked out a deranged laugh, not unlike that of a hyena's. "Oh ho ho. Shiggy does not like you." He decided to momentarily ignore the others in the area. "I think he'll do better if you're off his radar." He struggled to speak coherently. "Shiggy. Did he mean Shigaraki?" Izuku circled around Stain, fully transforming his arms and feet to demonic-looking claws. Both blade and claw met at the same time, making a ringing sound out from the impact. Izuku's other arm wasn't idle though, and he successfully took a chunk out of Stain's arm, severing the tendons and rendering it immobile. He took what little he got from it, and sucked on it. Stain let out a soft shit, and spun his arm from their impact to knock Izuku off balance. It worked, and he got an opportunity to slash Izuku's back, earning a yelp. He whipped back around, ignoring the wound on his back, and darted forward to make another laceration in the other villain's chest. Unfortunately, the wound was more pesky than he thought, and it made him just a little too slow. Stain used that opportunity to fling one of the daggers from his belt into the right arm of Izuku. He let out a high-pitched hiss as he retracted his arm to his chest. Stain then eyed the still paralyzed Shinsu and smirked when he realized what was happening. He used Izuku's momentary distraction to throw one of his blades at Shinsu. Unluckily for him, that's when Izuku's eyes sharpened, growing more animalistic. He used the injured hand to block the shot. Izuku let out a bone-chilling snarl, with the people around him wincing as that snarl grew deeper and laced with malice. Shinsu shakily let out a low whistle in the background. "Damn, shouldn't have done that. Now he's mad." At least that ruled out the theory of an imposter replacing his friend. Izuku's form shifted, and his head grew longer and bigger, with the rest of his body changing as well. He grew to about 3 times the size of Stain. He had a long, whip-like tail that flicked back and forth in agitation. At that point, his size was the main advantage, and he used it to pin Stain down on his back with hands splayed and helpless to his sides. The heroes could see the deep gashes on his back, arm, and hand rapidly heal as the dagger embedded in his hand popped out. Izuku could vaguely hear the others calling him to stop, and to not kill him. Well, he decided, might as well let him live. He put his teeth to the gash on Stain's shoulder, and ripped his arm off, enjoying his victory snack. There were yelps of shock, surprise, and horror. Shinsu found he could move and hurriedly took Stain's bandana to make a tourniquet, staunching the blood flow to keep him from dying. He went over to the others, and ate the arm as if it were payment for the heart he was unable to eat. Once the arm was gone, Izuku shrank slightly and turned back around to pay attention to the other occupants of the alley. Izuku saw the engine kid still on his back, and walked over on 4 legs to sniff him. Out of the corner of his eye he spotted a tense movement, but that movement quickly halted when they realized that he wasn't going to do anything. Izuku nudged the kid with his nose, urging him to get up. He then went over to the other 2 hero students, and sat in front of them, tail wagging like a dog waiting for praise. A deep purring resonated deep within his throat. Shinsu, abandoning all pretenses, went, "Mido, what the F?" and moved around in front of Izuku, cautiously waving his hand in the air over his snout. Izuku continued to purr and he nuzzled Shinsu's hand like a cat. Todoroki, with a finger on his chin, quietly said, "Well, now the cats make sense." Iida found that he was the last to be able to get up, and once he did, he went over to make sure Native was alive. He checked his pulse, and found that he was merely unconscious. Izuku, who was basking in the attention of Shinsu, suddenly froze. He gave out a soft whine and jumped onto the nearby fire escape and up onto the nearby rooftop. He was just in time too, as that was the moment that the pro-heroes arrived on the scene. Izuku laid low on the rooftops, as Endeavor himself beheld the scene with a scowl on his face. He did his best to not make any noise, whether it be contempt or not. He could hear Todoroki's hesitance when talking to his father, and it made Izuku want to rip the man's throat out. He did his best to creep down the wall on the other side of the building, in order to slink away and stay unknown to the heroes surrounding the area. However, that plan went out the window when he looked up and saw Shinsu being taken into the sky by a Namu. Even though it took him a while to get onto the ground, it took less than a second to get back up to the rooftops. He grew in size once more, this time a lot larger than he was before. He paid no mind to the heroes who stood frozen, doing absolutely nothing. Once Izuku was at the edge of the nearest rooftop, he gave a great leap toward the Namu, and snarled at the mindless creature taking one of his. Large claws latched onto the Namu's back, and Izuku's tail wrapped around Shinsu, who seemed to be in shock. He dug into the Namu's brain, rendering its regeneration useless, leaving it to die as it fell from so high off the ground. Izuku realized he didn't quite think this plan through, as there was no way to safely land Shinsu and himself. Luckily, as he attempted to right himself so that he'd take the brunt of the damage, he managed to make eye contact with Todoroki, and the frantic position must have alerted him to his predicament. Todoroki ran past his father and created an ice slide to catch the two of them. Izuku made use of the slide by letting it catch him as he slowed his descent with his talons. Once they were at a safe speed, he let go of Shinsu to let him jump down on his own. Once Shinsu was safely on the ground, Izuku registered the heroes that were yelling after him as his vision cleared from its haziness. Endeavor moved much faster than the other heroes, trying to sear the creature that was in front of him. The flames of the hellfire filled the small alley and poured into the street. Yet, it created a lot of shadows, and in a blink of an eye, there was no creature to be found, except for liquidy shadowed movement tucked away to the side, hiding itself until there was an opening for escape. When morning came, Izuku felt like he was hit by a truck. And when his memories caught up to him, he wished he was. 3 friends group chat. Yesterday 11:54 p.m. Zuko Light, what the F? I begs, Upi never swears. But I have to agree, so, what the F? Today 9:12 a.m. Green bean, surprise. Izuku bit his lip in nervousness. He just started to have friends, but he managed to F that up too. Before he could dig too deep into those thoughts, his phone dinged. Today 9:15 a.m. I begs, we gotta talk after we make it out of the hospital. Zuko Light, I agree. Green bean, where? Where do y'all wanna meet? Today 9:17 a.m. I begs, honestly, I kinda wanna relive just what the F happened. But slowly paced. So, at that trashed up beach. Dagobah or something. Green bean, I'm sure. I begs, and one more thing. I begs changes Green bean's name to Gremlin bean. Gremlin bean, I deserve that. Zuko Light, yes, you did. They eventually picked a time in the afternoon of the following day, after Todoroki and Shinsu were released from the supervision of the heroes. Izuku got there early, too nervous to have been on time. He let his shoulders loosen slightly when the sea breeze flowed over his shoulders, yet he still wrung his hands together as he sat on the sand in the clearer part of the trashed beach. He waited there for a while, using his fingers to draw in the sand. His knees were tucked into his chest, with his arms wrapped around them in a fetal position. He looked up when he heard 2 pairs of footsteps coming his way. Both boys stopped about 7 feet away. They looked at each other in what seemed to be a silent conversation, before Todoroki took a step forward. Izuku lowered his head as Todoroki said, "Before I found Stain, I was frantically looking for the right location sent to me by Shinsu." He stopped, looking like he was remembering something. "I think I blocked it out in how frantic I was, but," he stopped, and clenched his eyes shut. Shinsu stepped up forward and put a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, don't push yourself too hard." Todoroki put his hand on Shinsu's, and continued, "There were 2 bodies beside you, Midoriya. 2. Mostly eaten. Bodies." Izuku saw Shinsu stiffen. Todoroki started again, "Now I'm not about to accuse you of befriending us to murder us." Izuku lifted his head, unshed tears glistening in his eyes. "And no, why would I?" Todoroki gently held his hand up in a shush motion. "Because, when I found you, you didn't notice me until I was just out of your vision." The hand he was holding out faltered a bit. "I was there for about 2 minutes before that." Todoroki looked to be on the verge of losing it. "Why, you were covered in blood." "So much blood," he hiccuped. "I looked at you, and thought you looked familiar." But, he didn't finish. Izuku's breath hitched, eyes wide, and he held his hands up to his mouth. Todoroki went on, "You were just eating, and you had this look on your face." He gestured helplessly. "There was no disgust or anything over what you were doing," he hiccuped. "You even looked like you took pleasure in what you were doing. When you finally noticed me, why you jumped onto me, pinning me to the ground. I felt so scared." Izuku, that hand that was held out was shaking as he clenched his fist. "You were feral. I don't know how else to describe it. There was blood all over you. It was like I was mindless." Izuku took a deep breath. "I know. I remember. It was like I was being shoved to the backseat of my mind." Todoroki sank to his knees, and Izuku looked at Shinsu, and held his hands out, before getting up from his seated position and walking over to where Todoroki was shaking. He got onto his knees next to him. "This isn't the first time it's happened to me though," he said, as he gently put his left hand on Todoroki's right shoulder. "The first time this happened, actually, was when my mother came home from the store, and..." Both boys snapped their heads up to look at him, wide-eyed. Izuku raised his hands and waved them back and forth in a placating manner, and a sheepish smile on his face. No, don't worry, she's fine. I just scared her a bit." They relaxed at that. He continued, "But it's not exactly something I control. I've been suppressing this power for 15 years, so my actions to all of these things are amplified for a while." The two harshly sucked in a breath. but I think it was a bit of a good thing, because, well, you saw what was happening, Todoroki. A few moments passed, then Shinsu spoke up. I never got to thank you for saving my life. Hey. So basically, after you found me I was hi. And a blush reddened his cheeks. Both of you mean a lot to me, so that was probably why I was acting like a hyperactive cat. So when you got taken by that Namu, I wasn't about to let anything touch you after what had just happened. Silence. Then, a hysterical cackle came from Shinsu unexpectedly. Is that what that was? I thought it was kind of cute. He blurted, before a dark blush flooded his cheeks and he snapped his mouth shut. Todoroki, whose cheeks had also tinged pink, said, I thought it was rather cute as well. Instead of just his cheeks, Izuku's face lit up bright red. Todoroki, with some tears still falling, smiled a little. Afterwards, they couldn't figure out if you were a person or a quirked animal. That startled a laugh out of Izuku. It was chime-like and soothing to both the other boys' ears. Shinsu could see that the gentleness was back, and that it wasn't just a fluke. He silently let out a sigh of relief at the revelation. The three of them talked about nothing for a few hours, until the sun started to set, and all three of them expressed their acceptance of using each other's first names. They soon got up to leave, and Izuku hugged both other boys. I'm sorry both of you had to see me like that, he mumbled. Shadow shrugged helplessly, not quite knowing how to hug back. It was bound to happen at one point. Izuku grimaced. Yes, well, I was hoping it wasn't under circumstances like that. All three boys were eventually smiling as they went their separate ways. In the evening, a couple days later, Izuku walked into the league's bar, absolutely livid. His eyes were a blazing red, wild and manic. His mouth wasn't shaped into its usual wide smile, but instead a cold snarl with jagged teeth jutting out from his lips. He just barely managed to keep his hands, along with the rest of him, from transforming. So he stuffed them in his pockets. Who the F took one of mine? Because both Shinsu Hitoshi and Todoroki Shadow are off limits. As soon as Izuku started to speak, Shigaraki looked up from his gaming console so fast. Had Izuku been in any other state, he would have thought he had gotten whiplash from that. Before either Shigaraki or Kurogiri could say anything in response, Sensei's computer cracked to life with sound. My apologies, Quicklash, I wasn't aware you had staked a claim on those two. Both boys have such interesting quirks and Garudai. My doctor wanted to experiment on them. Sensei spoke. Izuku let out a low, reverberating warning growl. The occupants of the bar, for the first time they've ever experienced, could sense that Sensei was backtracking, trying to appease the being in front of them. But we accept that both boys belong to you, and we will not touch them, Sensei said. Izuku smiled, not wide, but jagged teeth and all. Good. The smile stayed for about a little longer while he stared at the ground for a bit. His face was back to normal after that, with a happy-looking neutral expression. He went to sit at the bar. Shigaraki looked at him pretty much the whole time. Yeah, this just reminds me not to piss you off again. Thanks, Shiggy. As Shigaraki turned back to his console, he spoke again. You're actually just in time too. We have a group of new recruits about to come in. Some were inspired by Stain, others are just in the player list. Izuku perked up in interest. Any malice in the past minute seemed to be gone. The change was almost frightening. Oi, Shigaraki, I've got your recruits. All three of them turned their heads toward the door, where Jiren was leaning against the frame of the door's threshold. He stepped aside to reveal a lineup of people. A deeply scarred man stood to the very right, first in line. He introduced himself as Dabai. Next in order were Toga, Spinner, Compress, Magni, Twice, Muscular, and Mustard. Having looked up their files beforehand, Izuku didn't need to ask to know who they were. Izuku's eyes lit up in faux merit. Sako, you made it. His smile was bright and innocent. And though he was wearing a mask, Compress looked slightly perturbed. Walking forward, he stopped in front of Izuku and shook his hand. Toga, the schoolgirl with two blonde, messy space buns, took that as her cue to get out of the line and skip up to Izuku. Oh, you're so cute. I could just eat you up. Shigaraki snorted, and muttered audibly, yeah, wrong choice of words. A small chuckle escaped Mr. Compress, who agreed with Shigaraki, having seen firsthand the actions of Izuku. Toga turned to give a confused look at both men. Why is that a weird choice of words? She turned back to Izuku, a confused but nonetheless happy expression on her face. Why is that weird? Izuku licked his lips. Tell me, Toga Himiko, have you ever heard the name Quicklash? He wasn't expecting her eyes to light up at the sound of his villain name, nor was he expecting her arms to wrap around his midsection. Oh, Quickhun is even more my idol than Staney. Of all the strange things he predicted, this wasn't one of them. Quickhun, he asked. Shigaraki wondered why that was the one weird thing he pointed out in this overall strange conversation. Toga kept up her fanged smile, of course. Quicklash is too long and too formal. Quickie sounds wrong, so does Lashy, but Quickhun sounds nice. She babbled. Izuku agreed with that logic. Okay then, he said. He then turned to Magni and started unloading his questions. Hi, do you prefer Magni full-time? Or do you want to keep that as a villain name? If the former, would you prefer Hikishi Magni? Or do you prefer Kenji when out in public? Wait, is Kenji your dead name? He put a finger to his chin as he rambled. Magni was surprised. She'd heard of the famed Quirkless's ruthlessness, but this was nothing like the rumors. This made him seem more human. In terms of emotions, at least. She remembered she was supposed to be answering his questions. She wasn't going to ask how he knew their names, if compress was any indication. She smiled brightly. I'd prefer Magni full-time. My parents were transphobic and refused to legally change my name. So yes, Kenji is my dead name. Izuku soaked up the information like a sponge. He smiled innocently, despite the fact that he was anything but. It went on like that in a strangely routine manner, and when he got to Dabai, who introduced himself as just Dabai, he wasn't going to pry further than that. He left the bar a few hours later, happy with all his new friends, and happy that they agreed to his terms of not touching what belongs to him. And he only had to make one threat to them. That was a new record. Tsukachi figured that he should be ecstatic at the new information on the Soul Stealer case, but instead that feeling of dread grew heavier. It was only a suspicion, still, but it was more than they've had this entire time. Endeavor spotted a strange creature at the location of the 3 UA students in their fight with Stain. There wasn't a good descriptive image of it, but many of the witnesses at the scene, mostly heroes who were used to giving descriptions, they said that its claws looked razor sharp, as did its teeth. But that wasn't the link to the case, no. The link to the case was a mere 2 blocks over, where 2 bodies were found. One of them was missing a heart, the other had its heart outside of its body, but barely touched. But this is also a good thing. Now they know slightly more of what to look for in suspects. Transformative type quirk most likely requires human flesh, or the person is just crazy. Tsukachi figured that this new piece of information deserved an actual good night's sleep. A few days later, both Shadow and Hitoshi were at Izuku's house. It was the weekend, and Inko was fine with it, as long as they didn't get too out of hand. Izuku's face lit up a bright scarlet when she said that, and he held his face in his hands in embarrassment while the 2 boys choked on spit behind him. She then left them to go to a work potluck, leaving lunch in the fridge for them. Once she was gone, it was only then that Izuku's face went back to its normal shade. He turned around to the boys and asked, "So what do you want to do?" Shadow seemed to be in thought, while Hitoshi blurted, "I want to see you be the creature again." Izuku blinked and blinked again. "Oh okay. Like, how?" Hitoshi responded by leading all 3 of them over to the couch, pushing the coffee table out of the way, and grabbing Izuku's arm. Hitoshi also tugged the half and half boy down to sit next to him. Hitoshi studied his arm intently. "Can you do your arm first?" Izuku shrugged and let his arm transform. A gray, marbleous substance crept down his arm, starting from his shoulder. It was almost shiny in the way it reflected light, and as it spread to his hand, his fingers sharpened into talons. Both Hitoshi and Shadow were entranced by the sight. As the other arm did the same thing, the substance crept past his shoulders and disappeared into his shirt. As Izuku looked at Hitoshi for further direction, both boys could already see the change in their friend. His eyes had an intensity that wasn't previously there. Also, when he wasn't moving, the changes didn't seem that big. Though slightly perturbed, Hitoshi continued, "You can just go from there, I guess." Both he and Shadow supposed they should be scared at the wide smile that overtook their friend's face, but they weren't. When he moved, it was in a way that no human could hope to replicate. It was as though he was liquid, keeping himself in human shape well, until he wasn't. His legs were shrouded in the same gray substance as his arms, and there were large, razor-sharp talons where his feet were supposed to be. His form rippled as his body grew. He opened his mouth, unhinging his entire jaw, which then gave it the space to grow into a maw, with the rest of his head following suit. His tongue was definitely longer than Hitoshi's arm. He looked like what parents would describe to their children as the monster under your bed, except more horrifying. His back arched as a low growl made its way up his throat. A tail grew from his jeans, long and thin but with 4 seams in it. Without scratching the floor, he pawed at the ground and whined. Shadow got up from where he was sitting next to Hitoshi and walked over to Izuku. Before Shadow could say anything, however, Izuku used his very long tongue to lick his cheek, covering the boy's face in saliva. He went over to Hitoshi and did the same thing. Like before, he acted almost like a cat. But it was more akin to the stereotype of the terror that black cats induce on Halloween. Shinsu was again struck with the uncanny feeling that this wasn't a quirk, but instead something else. While not hungry, Izuku felt different than he usually did in this form. Well, considering he was only ever in this form in a fight or doing other things, it was a new experience. How did he feel? Territorial, perhaps. Yes, that sounded right. He didn't even have to question what exactly he was territorial of, if the events of a few days ago were any indication. There was a hand waving in front of his face, snapping him out of his daydreams. He looked over to the owner of said hand, which belonged to Shadow. "Sorry." Both boys jumped both very high off the sofa and very high onto the sofa. Hitoshi coughed out a laugh. Shadow just coughed, choking slightly. There was a delighted laugh reminiscent of a hyena coming from Izuku's direction, and both boys looked over to see Izuku doing a little dance and prancing in a circle to show his enjoyment at their reactions. Sorry. He turned back around to face them. When I'm not, he thought about it for a moment. Out of it, I can talk, but well, not physically. That was true, Hitoshi thought, because Izuku's mouth was indeed not moving. Izuku laid down next to the sofa and began speaking, though not quite as brusque as before. What are you both going to do now? He asked, saying his next words carefully. You both saw what happened the other night. You guys go to a hero school. I'm a villain. As if it wasn't obvious before, he looked up from his spot in the ground to see contemplative looks, similar to his own just earlier. Hitoshi heaved a large sigh, pinched the bridge of his nose, and said, I was always called a villain because of my quirk. It didn't matter what I did otherwise. He stared down at his hands. At this point, I'm becoming a hero out of spite to those who said I couldn't. He looked up at his two best friends, but then I find out that a person really close to me is a villain, not just because of his quirk, but because it's more freeing. Hitoshi looked conflicted, but in his eyes bore resolve. Is that true? He looked over to Izuku, who nodded, and continued bobbing his head. Then I can become a villain, sure. Hitoshi looked like a weight was lifted off his shoulders. He took a deep breath, put a hand to his chest, and went, that felt really nice to say. Then he felt a hand on his shoulders. He looked over to see Shadow giving him a pensive look. In a whirl, Izuku was back in human form, standing up with a bright smile on his face that lit up the room. He stumbled, however, obviously not used to switching back that fast. Shadow looked at his left hand, and back up at his friends. My father is a horrible person. All my life he shaped me into a hero to surpass him where he couldn't surpass All Might. I decided to become a hero for my mom. But she gave me this burn. He gestured up to the scar on the left side of his face. Izuku shook in suppressed anger, though he wanted to hear out his friend before he did anything reckless, and for years, I've been wondering what I did wrong. Because every time something bad happens, it's always my fault. Both Hitoshi and Izuku sat on either side of him, offering wordless comfort. Todoroki took a breath and continued, but being with people who genuinely care about me, I've realized that it's not my fault, and that being a hero serves no purpose for me anymore. An unbidden, genuine smile appeared on Shadow's face, even as drops of tears ran shamelessly down his face. But I can be whoever I want to be. And I can do that with the people I love. Izuku couldn't take it anymore, and he tackled both of them in a hug, keeping the three of them together for minutes. It was a few hours later, when the sky had turned violet, that three figures sat on the railing of a fire escape. This hat is itchy. Izuku shot a look at Hitoshi, who was messing with his beanie, trying and failing to scratch his head because of the leather gloves he was wearing. Shadow sighed and grabbed Hitoshi's hand and pulled it away from his head. Then he reached up and scratched the place that Hitoshi was batting at. A contented sigh left him, as he nodded gratefully in Shadow's direction. All three boys were in disguises, with Izuku in his black hair dye and red eye color, Shadow in a black wig, and Hitoshi wearing a beanie to cover his hair. Izuku was excited, and it was apparent in his body language. They agreed that they weren't going to do anything drastic, but were instead going to start with some simple arson. Izuku jumped down from the fire escape, landing lightly on his feet. He looked back to see that Hitoshi and Shadow went a few floors lower before jumping. Izuku looked at Shadow and thought for a moment. What do you feel when you lose your flames? Shadow had a strange look on his face, and Izuku wondered why he was so surprised at the question. He put a hand up to his chin. It feels like I'm conforming to what he's been ordering me to do. Like he held out his hands in front of him, deep in thought. Like I'm being weighed down. Izuku hummed, before looking up at the light-polluted starless sky. Then what would happen if you released that weight? At the curious look sent his way, he elaborated. You said everything related to being a hero is due to your father. And that includes your quirk. A nod. Then doesn't that mean, by releasing a weight, you're acknowledging that your power is your own? Suddenly, the entire alley lit up. If there were any stars in the sky before, then they were completely overtaken by the brightness of a flame. Izuku had to shield his eyes, lest he be blinded. Hitoshi had stepped back in the first place since Izuku was literally playing with fire here. A few moments passed, and the fire had finally started to decrease in its brightness. Standing there, clothing scorched, as well as the ground, was Shadow, breathing heavily from the obvious overuse of his quirk. There was a smile on his face as sharp as his own eyes. His eyes were wide in a bit of manic glee, and Izuku was surprised that he was that close to the tipping point. The group's surroundings were singed, with the brick walls on either side blackened, some even to the point of crumbling into charcoal. A low, impressed whistle erupted from Hitoshi. Nice one, Shu. That's the most fire I've seen from you in the entire time I've known you. He turned to Izuku, who seemed to be quietly contemplating something, and said, I can only think of one way to use my quirk right now. He looked slightly uncomfortable as he suggested the idea, and Izuku wasn't going to push him. All three of them were in an alley, so instead of elaborating, Hitoshi stepped out into the street, right as someone walked by. The immediate collision resulted in the passerby stumbling to the ground. Hitoshi extended a hand to help the person up. Izuku recognized the person from the sports festival, and was wondering what a prospective hero student was doing out so late at night. Izuku noticed that Hitoshi side-eyed him as the person was getting up. He spoke to the person, "Ni, Ajiru-san, sorry about that. It appears I wasn't looking where I was going." Ah, Izuku understood now. Ajiru Mishiro, the student who sabotaged Hitoshi in the sports festival. Ajiru looked surprised to see him, which isn't that much of a shocker, considering that it's well into the later hours of the night, and Shinsu was notorious for being an insomniac just like their teacher. Hitoshi smiled sheepishly, wrapping an arm around him, with his hand on the small of his back, right above his tail. He guided him toward the mouth of the alley, where Shadow and Izuku were waiting silently in the shadows. Ajiru seemed oblivious to the obvious manipulation of Hitoshi's actions on him. Ajiru-san, do you remember middle school? The hero student blinked at the non-sequitur, before answering, "You mean when all those students called you a villain for your quirk?" The boy seemed to realize something, and Izuku had already gone to block the entrance of the alley. Ajiru laughed nervously. "But that's all behind us, right? Everyone knows you're not a villain. You're in the hero class, aren't you?" Hitoshi hesitated, before taking a deep breath. "I know I'm in the class, but what do you think about my quirk?" Ajiru was fidgeting now, obviously uncomfortable. Izuku smirked at his obvious situational awareness. Yet he thought he was with a friend. Clearly they haven't gotten to the point where that's the biggest opening. He shakily answered, "What about it? I know I said a couple things in middle school, but I was just following along with everyone else. I didn't mean them." A smirk overtook Hitoshi's face. "Are you sure about that?" Ajiru had a startled look on his face. He wrenched himself free from Hitoshi's grip, walking rapidly backwards and what he'd hoped was away from him. "Am I sure?" His face fell slack. He was under Hitoshi's control. Now it was time to have some fun. Hitoshi tugged at the collar of his shirt. "I've been waiting for this." He looked at the helpless form of his classmate, and smiled, before telling Ajiru to do the chicken dance, while making noise like a chicken. Izuku and Shadow got a kick out of it, and it prompted Hitoshi to laugh with them. Finally, after 5 minutes of squawking, Hitoshi made him stop. He promptly turned to face Izuku. "I brought you a midnight snack," he said, as he walked over to Shadow to watch the scene that unfolds. It was actually Izuku who looked hesitant this time, surprisingly. "Are you guys sure? It'll get messy. And I thought we were just doing some arson." Shadow smiled softly, and Hitoshi thought to himself that he wanted to see it more often. "We're sure. And the opportunity is right here." That seemed to placate him. He turned to Ajiru and pinned him against the wall and his back facing towards them. "Toshi, if you will." And just like that, instead of the compliant zombie they'd had moments before, they had a thrashing hero student. "Shinsu, what are you doing?" Izuku stopped his thrashing abruptly by grabbing the boy's tail with sharp, taloned hands. The boy looked desperately to the side to look at the aforementioned boy, and when he spotted Shadow, he visibly sighed in relief. "Todoroki-san, please help me. Shinsu's gone crazy." Todoroki, as stone-faced as he usually is when he's not around Izuku, simply said, "Don't insult my friend. D-head ... and that's not Hitoshi holding you." Ajiru paled. Simple as that. Izuku looked back at the two boys one more time as a final warning. They both, in sync, made the go-ahead motion with their hands. Izuku turned back to the quivering boy. He licked his lips loudly in the hero student's ear. He bit into the boy's neck, moaning as blood spurted in all directions. In the boy's ear he whispered, "You have such a nice back. It would be a shame if someone were to rip." He ripped back the boy's tail, taking his spinal cord with it. "Hit out." There were a lot of gurgled cries erupting from Ajiru. Izuku finally pulled his body away from the wall and threw it on the ground, facing up. Izuku Quicklash stood over the body, mouth covered in blood. It took him no time nor resistance to rip open the boy's chest. Shadow and Hitoshi watched in morbid fascination as Izuku licked each of their former classmates' ribs clean. Even as Quicklash's body changed, both boys found the scene rather ... hot. Quicklash grabbed the still pulsing heart, and swallowed it without much fanfare, though his visibility to the normal human eye shimmered in and out of view. A few moments of tense silence occurred, before it was broken by Hitoshi, who walked over to the mangled corpse of Ajiru. I guess all those claims about me being a villain are true. Shame it had to turn out like this." He ground his heel into one of the vertebrae, crushing the bone into splinters. He wondered if there was something wrong with him. Because here was a loss of human life, and instead of doing anything to stop it, he watched, and even participated, in some sick, twisted pleasure. It was only a few days ago where he felt nauseated at the sight ... So what changed? At the time of mid-morning the next day, the news of another dead hero student spread throughout the city like wildfire. People were, understandably, scared out of their minds. The hustle and bustle of the Musutafu police station was getting to be overwhelming at this point. There were visitors left and right. A lot of those visitors consisted of friends and family of the latest victim, Ajiru Meshurao. There was crying, screaming, people demanding explanations that no one could give. All of them were obviously in the first stages of grief. Yet there were few exceptions. Tsukachi was elbow-deep in paperwork, and this latest death was only making matters worse. He didn't know how much more of this he could take. It was like some god out there heard his cries because... Excuse me. Tsukachi sat up from where he had his head in his hands, only to see a green-haired child peeking through the cracked door. The boy looked nervous to be there, but that was understandable. He frowned. Shouldn't you be talking to the receptionist? The boy fidgeted. I tried, multiple times, but they just kept directing me to other people, who then just directed me to you. Tsukachi had to refrain from pinching the bridge of his nose at the incompetence shown by his subordinates. Okay, that's fine. What did you want to speak about? At that, the boy brightened, almost to the point where the detective wondered if that was his quirk. Yes, okay, thank you. I was wondering if I could possibly intern here. I know a lot of people are stressed out for some reason, because there's a lot of people out in the waiting room, and I thought you'd like some help. The boy then offered a sheet of paper to Tsukachi, who took it and read it over. He was slightly surprised to find a full cover letter and resume. Oh, and he definitely underestimated the boy's age. He thought he was like 11. But no, it turns out the boy is 15. Midoriya Izuku, huh? Tsukachi quickly scanned it, and what stuck out most to him was the skill in hero analysis. He stopped on a full-fledged analysis of the underground hero, Rocklock. This particular hero was more unknown than Eraserhead. It was surprisingly detailed and accurate. Maybe he could help, he thought, before mentally shaking his head. No, he needs training first. Tsukachi realized that he may have been thinking for a little too long, because the boy had started to mumble under his breath. Oh no, is it too creepy? I probably should have done a more daylight hero. Or probably Eraserhead, since he's been in the media lately, but they still don't know his quirk. I'm probably being creepy again. Maybe I should just take it back before they. You're hired, said Tsukachi. Izuku blinked owlishly. Reject it, he finished. What the detective said took a second to register in his mind. When his brain caught up, a bright smile overtook his face. Thank you. I promise I won't let you down. What do I have to do first? Tsukachi was nearly blinded by the enthusiasm. Either that's got to be his quirk, or Tsukachi needs a hell of a lot more sleep. The detective let go of the mug of his coffee, put his hands in front of him, and looked at the boy. He separated his mess of paperwork into two piles. He gestured to the one on the left. These are my finished paperwork. Could you stack them into the file cabinet behind me in alphabetical order? I'm really on a backlog right now and use as much extra help as I can get. The green-haired boy complied with the order. The two of them stayed there working in a companionable silence for a while. Tsukachi was surprised at the amount of productivity the two of them accomplished. The boy was smart and equally adaptable. Honestly, it shouldn't have been as much of a surprise as it was when he eventually checked his phone to find that it was 5 p.m. He looked up to find the boy, Midoriya, just sorting the last of the paperwork into their respective cabinets. Midoriya looked up at him, still as eager as he was hours ago. Tsukachi visibly checked his watch, even though his internal clock knew what time it was, give or take an hour or so. All right, kid, your first official day starts tomorrow at 7 a.m. sharp. Don't be late. He gave a half-hearted salute towards the kid as he bowed before leaving. Tsukachi has always had a soft spot for kids, especially when he went through this one's file specifically. Quirkless, he could sorta relate. It had taken him and his family a while to realize his quirk, as subtle as it was. He told the rest of the officers of the new, official, as of 5 minutes ago, intern. After the few cheers, he then reprimanded them on them being so incompetent as to let a teenager get all the way to his office on line of deferral. Izuku wet his lips. He sat on a park bench, waiting. It was like 12 a.m., and no one else was around. Izuku had made sure to be on the edge of the park, in case the person he was meeting had requested backup. The person he was waiting for sat down next to him, only after he had waited for about 20 minutes. There was no backup in sight. So you're Shinsu-kun and Todoroki-kun's friend. Izuku looked toward the person speaking, having been snapped out of his musings. The voice belonged to the boy who had been collapsed in the alley during the fight with Stain. Izuku made sure to put on a brighter smile than usual. Yep, that's me. He made a sit-down motion with his hand. The bespectacled boy hesitated, which was smart on his part, before complying. It was awkward for a moment where nobody talked. Izuku's smile slowly fell, and a neutral expression took its place. So, Izuku began, snaking his left hand around the boy's shoulders in what outsiders would see as a familiar gesture of long-time friends. Iida-san, right. Hitoshi and Shadow have told me about you. Izuku's smile was sharp, and he could smell the fear radiating from Iida. As his arm wrapped around his shoulders, his hand stopped at his neck, and curled itself into a claw. As it did so, his fingers sharpened accordingly into what seemed like something metallic. Iida muttered softly, shit. However, it seemed that Iida could sense something about how Izuku was reacting, because he said, Todoroki mentioned your name once. Bakugo shouted some drivel about how you were quirkless. Izuku couldn't help a snarl at the word, with his face shifting into something else, but going back too fast to catch it. Iida huffed a tight breath. That just proves my theory. Izuku's head snapped up to him, and the claw around Iida's throat tightened almost enough to break skin. Iida stiffened and grew more still. He didn't dare move his head, lest he bleed. A low, near inaudible growl radiated from Izuku, unless one was as close to Izuku as Iida was. What theory? Iida looked like he had to refrain from either crying in fear or pushing his glasses up his nose to get ready to talk. Iida, without moving his neck, looked toward the green-haired boy and said, You're not human. Izuku froze. He stopped holding himself back. There was no one else around. He grew, standing up. Turning back to face Iida, he licked his lips. and grew more menacing. He spoke. Such a shame. Iida Tenya, you seemed like a good person. Iida started to frantically wave his hands in a sort of panicked and robotic way. Wait, Izuku stopped, humoring him. Iida recognized this, and hurriedly continued, I came to have a negotiation with you. Iida's hands continued waving frantically. Izuku's head tilted to the side. Oh. Iida visibly shuddered, violently. I am honor-bound to protect the innocent and would have protected you in your youth had I known your situation, of being quirkless I mean. But I cannot promise that I won't try to stop you, should I see it. However, if you restrict your wrath and do it out of sight, I will have nothing to speak of. Even with such a change in face shape, Izuku smiled. Interesting way to put it, Iida-san. He stepped back from where he was leaning close to Iida. He stopped growing, and instead started shrinking back down to his normal self. Izuku put on the same bright smile from beforehand, before waving goodbye to Iida and skipping away. This left Iida with the realization that he had just been very, very close to death. So much that he had nearly heard the Grim Reaper laughing. With that in mind, he let out a shaky breath and walked away as well. There was the sound of heels, echoing through the alleyway. A woman in her mid-20s was walking home from work, taking an often-used shortcut back to her home. It was an effective way to shake off reporters and paparazzi. Even as dangerous as the alley was late at night, Iwabami was a hero. It was nothing she couldn't handle. She had made her way into the higher ranks in a short amount of time. But even she needed her space. Since she was so high up in the rankings, that clearance allowed her to know about the Soul Stealer case. That being said, she was briefed on the places where the serial killer frequented. Her influence was dwindling due to lack of action when it came to capturing villains. She didn't know why it's so hard to take down this one villain. It was unreasonable that it's taken the police this long to piece things together. So that was the reason Iwabami was a little annoyed when a supposed fan came up to her to ask for her autograph. He was a cute little thing. Fluffy black hair and purple eyes made for an adorable kid. She may have been in a bad mood, but who was she to turn down the opportunity for an autograph? That was her mistake. The boy stared up at her. He wasn't particularly short, but enough that he had to incline his head a little to look her in the eyes. Iwabami had done her part, so she was a little annoyed when she didn't at least get a thank you from the child. The child merely tilted his head and continued to stare at her before speaking. Iwabami-san, you know it's dangerous to walk around alone. Isn't there a serial killer on the loose? A tick appeared on her forehead. This child assumed she was helpless, even though she was a hero. She didn't give the child the satisfaction of an answer. Yet there was something off about his sentence, with one of the things he said. It took her a moment to realize, but when she did, her veins turned to ice. And no, it can't be. Iwabami's body responded slower than her mind. The Soul Stealer. She couldn't believe it. This child. The boy looked thoughtful. Oh, is that what they're calling me now? His tentative look turned into more of a smirk. Without warning, he punched her sternum, which knocked the breath out of her chest and toppled her in one go. Such a shame, the monster in human skin said, as she struggled to catch her breath and keep her eyes open. So much power and yet. He grabbed the writhing snakes on the hero's head, smiling as she screamed out in pain. It's all wasted on some fame-hungry whore who couldn't make it in modeling. Yuani Sayaka. She tried to get up and level out her disadvantage. He caught her by surprise, that's it. But she knew it was a lost cause, especially as he ripped her precious snakes from her head, eliciting an agonized scream from her. This was quickly shut up by the iron grip on her neck, yet she still remained crying. She probably should have listened to whatever her analysis department said about this killer. They were supposed to be good at that kind of stuff, right? Then she would have known something about this killer's mannerisms. The burning pain that radiated through her skull did nothing to help do something about the fight or flight instincts rearing up in her. She was in no position to move, since her neck was being held down. Izuku's eyes gleamed with hunger and glee. He loved the point where his victims realized that there was no way out. With this particular hero, he decided that he wanted to keep her head intact, perhaps as a way to debut. He saw as she struggled to keep her eyes open. Oh, did you want some help with that? Her face scrunched up with confusion even as he laughed. Your eyes, silly. He gave no time for comprehension as he took his knee to her neck, so that he could have both hands free. Quicklash cupped her face with faux gentleness, before taking both his thumb and forefinger, and pinching at her eyelid. He could feel her panic under him, but he ignored it as he ripped out her right eyelid, making her unable to close that eye. Regardless of the pressure on Iwabami's neck, she let out a gurgled shriek. Now that at least one of her eyes was open, he let her watch as he transformed. From the knee on her neck, he switched to his shoe, and then she soon learned that it wasn't a shoe at all, but an illusion. Jagged talons took their place, and gripped her neck like a hand would. The creature that stood before her was aptly named, in her opinion. There was nothing she could do against this monstrous creature. Her tears mixed with her blood, and the salt burned. The last thing she saw before she died was rows upon rows of teeth that tore open her chest and caused blood to rush through the tightness that was her C's throat. It gurgled out of her mouth, and she fell into unconsciousness. She would never wake up. Quicklash was delighted at the power that coursed through his veins because of the hero's heart. He decided to thank her, of course. It was only fair. He put more pressure on her neck, which allowed him to easily rip her head from her body. He wasn't that far from a flagpole in the middle of a popular park. He stuck her head on it like a pike, and in her blood, wrote on the ground, "What a lovely name you all gave me. I might as well use it." Satisfied, he slunk into the shadows and disappeared.